All right, everybody. It looks like we are live on the YouTubes. I'm Stalin Smith Jr. for the Unapologetic Apologists. Right before I introduce my guest, I'm going to make sure the sound is working. Sound is working. All right. So, yeah, here with me today, I have my friend Tyler Vela. Tyler, thank you so much for being here, brother.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Absolutely, yeah. So
last-minute arrangement.
Yeah. So you haven't been on this show before. You and I have been on Dunphy's show before. I think we were critiquing Matt Dillahunty when we did that. So yeah, I knew you wanted to talk about free will, but I guess before we do that, just introduce yourself to the audience. Maybe normally I ask people how they came to faith and what got them interested in apologetics.
Yeah. So, well, I'm Tyler. I host the Free Thinker podcast and blog, and now YouTube channel. I have a YouTube channel really dedicated. It's just really starting. I think I only have a few videos on it and some other like conference appearances and stuff. But that one's dedicated to dealing with apologetics with mostly geared towards atheism, naturalism, some of those types of positions. The podcast is more of kind of a labor of love, whatever I'm studying for my master's program, or what, research papers that I did in undergrad or again in master's. There's apologetics in there, but a lot of it also has to do with in-house discussions about Reformed theology, Molinism. I've had Chris Date on to talk about the concept of hell. Did a large research work on Genesis 1 and views on that. So that's really what the podcast and the blog are dedicated to, kind of anything in and around that biblical theology, systematic theology, apologetics area. I am working on my master's right now at Reformed Theological Seminary. Have my undergrad in biblical studies from Moody Bible Institute. And I went to school at Sonoma State, which is a secular state school out here in California for philosophy and English. I was about a semester away from finishing that program and went into the ministry instead. Actually, one of the larger things where I'm like, I wish I would have waited a semester. I would have finished my degree and I had a double major in philosophy and English, but whatever. So went through all of that. I am an ordained elder in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, conservative Presbyterian denomination. What was the other question? Oh, how I came interested in apologetics. So I actually grew up in an unbelieving household, largely secular, not hard atheistic or anything like that. I was probably more atheistic than my parents were, but definitely not religious whatsoever. Like when I first became a Christian, my first Christmas after becoming a Christian, I was like, that's what the Christmas carols are about. Like I didn't even know what the Christmas. I didn't know. I had nothing. So it's always funny when people are like, "Oh, you were indoctrinated," and I was like, "By who?" Like whatever. So I was an atheist all throughout high school and into college. And it was actually my philosophy class. I had a metaphysics class, and my professor was an atheist who was actually going through the first part of the metaphysics class was on arguments for the existence of God, and one of them was the moral argument. And I actually found the moral argument entirely convincing, which started me down the road, which is probably why I ended up being reformed and presuppositional, because part of what ended me going down into theism, and then God brought me home in Christianity, is the notion or the realization that my prior naturalism couldn't account for life, couldn't account for objective moral values, couldn't account for logic, couldn't account for minds, persons, something from nothing, and any of these things. That was actually one of the first things that got me questioning my naturalism. So that has always just led me into apologetics. I've always been interested in philosophy and history and topics dealing with that. So when I became a Christian, the outlet for that is apologetics. So here I am.
Yeah. So wait a minute, Tyler. You expect us to believe you became a Christian because of the evidence and not because you wanted a coping mechanism with death?
So crazy. I know. I actually wasn't afraid of death. My life was fine. I have a really boring conversion experience. I wasn't like living on the street, like doing meth, or like wasn't like a raging alcoholic. Like my life was in shambles, and I didn't have any. I was going along just fine. I was actually a relatively, in the kind of lateral sense, a relatively like ethical person. Didn't sleep around.
Yeah.
Wasn't a big, I drank, but I wasn't like blackout drunk or anything. Like I'm just, as now coming to Christ and being a Christian, I understand, sinful depravity and all of that kind of thing that went along with it. I wasn't saying I was a righteous person by any stretch of the imagination, but it wasn't. Yeah, when atheists are like, oh, you were afraid of death and you were just looking for something to cope, and I was like, coping with what? Like I was fine, I was happy, whatever. So it was actually upon I would say the arguments had a good pejorative. They were a good negative effect on my existing worldview at the time. That really it really undermined my worldview at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same. People always ask me. I was just raised I was raised as a Christian. I always believed basically, and I've thought sometimes that's kind of boring. I kind of wish maybe I had more of the J. Warner Wallace story. Yeah, because then you feel like it's something more when you're telling atheists, like, oh, I wasn't indoctrinated. Look, I became because of the evidence. But I think there's some upsides and there's some downsides to that. I think part of it can be a point of humility to an extent. Like in churches, there's what would you say, a proclivity? I can't think of the word.
Proclivity.
A proclivity, to kind of praise the person who, like you said, was on the street, was on drugs, and look, Jesus saved me. I'm not saying we shouldn't praise that, but it's like, well, there's no love to the guy who's just maybe struggling with some things, but you don't know because they're kind of private, and he's in the Word every day, and he's being diligent in his walk with God, and just trying to stay on the straight and narrow. That's no easy task to take on. I think. But yeah,
it's much more of a testament to the faithfulness of God to his promises, that the promises are for you and your children. When someone is raised up as in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and I mean that's a strong testament to the faithfulness of God. I mean, if you think of the parable son, we always love the prodigal son. We miss that the dutiful son is the Pharisees and is actually more wretched than the prodigal son. We often miss that whole point of the parable. But what's interesting is that neither of the sons are truly a good son. They're both awful sons. They both hate their father, just in different ways. And so it's actually there's no, in the parable, if there was a good son, it would be a dutiful son who remained in the house, who still loved the father, who rejoiced with the father when the prodigal came back, who mourned the other son who complained against the father. I mean, that son, the son that's you in the story isn't in that story. But that's a testament to the faithfulness of God, since those two sons are not good sons. So
yeah, kind of pricks, but
we weirdly fixate on the prodigal. I mean, we call it the parable of the prodigal son, but really it's the parable of the father, or the parable of the two sons. You're absolutely right. For some reason, we aggrandize that prodigal son. It's the return. We love that story, almost to the exclusion of all other testimonies.
Yeah, but I think, like you said, a much better point about it is that it's about the father's love. It's not about the son was such a good person that he came running back. It was that the father was so loving that he accepted him even after he wasn't a good son. So that's a good point. So so I guess just to jump right in, I mean, I guess I'll let you direct the conversation. We were talking beforehand, a podcast I did with John Dunphy and a couple others a while back, and we had mentioned some stuff about free will in response to the thing we were talking about, but then that sparked some interest on your part to have a discussion about it.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm on somewhat of baby duty, so I have like baby monitors over here on silent. So I'm
good.
They're napping, but I thought I heard something. I thank you for having me on. We've been trying to kind of have this discussion for a bit of time. I enjoy the conversations. I usually, I don't know if you guys started calling it the youth group. I know it's the Youth Apologetics Empire, but whatever. So I enjoy watching those videos and those discussions. But sometimes, because you all are very in the same group, you're in the same kind of theological framework. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I wish they had like this alternative this alternative position represented because and Dunphy tries, but then he's sort of Calvinistic, but not fully. So sometimes we'd be like, oh, but you could add this caveat. There's actually a lot of benefit to having this viewpoint in your apologetic arsenal. There's sometimes the responses that apologists give to atheists or to unbelievers, or sometimes these arguments sometimes can fall flat or fall short. And I think that a reformed apologetic can actually come and be a robust response in some of these cases. I mean, I obviously think it's more often a robust response, and evidentialism can kind of support that, but obviously we would see that differently. But I think having that additional perspective. So you all have
we'll just do that real quick. I mean, I wasn't necessarily part of the forming process of the group. I just kind of because John Duffy and I did stuff together so often, he just kind of included me in. I was like, okay, sure, I'll go with it, I guess. And it just so kind of happens that I think a lot of us are. Well, I don't necessarily. I know I can speak for David Paulman, who's a Molinist. I am. And then there's some, but I just want to say how much I agree with what you're saying. I'm very pro, like, I don't like when, for example, Christians attack each other over the old earth versus young earth debate. Like on one hand is, oh, you don't care what the actual Bible says, you're compromising it for science. And the other side is like, well, you don't care about science. And I'm like, well, listen, I think intellectual diversity is a good thing because it keeps the structure from becoming dogmatic and rigid. So I do think, yes, intellectual diversity is really good.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And let me say, I didn't mean that as a critique of the group in any way whatsoever.
Right.
Like I said, I enjoy the show immensely. I listen to all of your guys' discussions. I really appreciate the insights that you have. I'm always impressed by, I sound like such an old man turning 40 this year, but I'm consistently impressed by the quality of young apologists who are coming up through the ranks. When I was your guys' age, literally the only thing that was really out about apologetics was biblical inerrancy, and I was actually just talking about to someone the other day. The main topics were biblical inerrancy and what is truth, because relativism and postmodernism was the topic of the day. So there just wasn't a lot of other things written, and right now apologetics has just I mean, apologetics has been around for millennia, but it has just come into a heyday and just blossomed so much. And I'm so thoroughly impressed by the young apologists coming up through the ranks who are really widely read on a lot of different topics. I always try to, I've given Chase, and I think Chase as well. I know John and I shared that friendship, but I talked to Chase and John and others and said, make sure you're getting some depth too, not just width. But I'm super impressed by the knowledge in that group. I always appreciate it, even if sometimes to some comments I'm like, no.
Right.
But I appreciate it.
John apparently had to talk everybody else into letting me in because I was considered to be too old.
So
that's okay.
Just made the cut.
Part of it is the technological revolution. It would have been the case that you had to go to university to get a, sophisticated degree. And that is still true to an extent, although because, sophisticated thinkers who have gone and gotten, multiple PhDs, like Bill Craig, who has 2 PhDs, we can get all the books he's read and just kind of get all that work condensed. And then YouTube, and you guys got guys like John McCrae who make it more popular for a younger crowd.
Yeah.
That is such a blessing.
Yeah, and just the digital access to papers, to all of these peer-reviewed papers. You don't have to do. I mean, when I first started, you had to do interlibrary loan and had to get photocopied and sent. It was a nightmare if you wanted to get 4 papers and they were in all different places. And it wasn't easy. Now within 30 minutes, I can go on the Atla database and I can pull 60 papers on the topic I want, download them and read them when I need to. It's just, the access that you all have is just. I'm very excited for the work that you all are going to do and continue to do. So again, I didn't mean that, I'm not trying to say the group is theologically myopic or anything like that, or that was intentionally to exclude other views, nothing like that. But what I mean is that sometimes sitting there, I'll want to chime in and be like, okay, but what about this? So if you can find a young Reformed guy to get in there, But part of that is you all were talking. I don't actually remember. It's been long enough that we've been trying to arrange this conversation. I don't remember what started it. but you all were talking about freedom, about free will, about moral culpability. I think the problem of suffering was a response. Do you remember the rationality rules that you guys were responding to?
So it was his video. He was critiquing an argument that. Oh no, I think he was actually critiquing other atheists who said, "Well, you can't disprove God." And I think he was making the point, "Well, you can't disprove God." And so I don't remember particularly either, but I would assume, based on what you're saying, that one of his ways of proving God doesn't exist would be to use the problem of evil. So that makes sense.
Yeah, that probably does. So and maybe that's a good launching point, right? So the problem of evil, right? So part of the difference in how we respond to the problem of evil, like we would probably share certain arguments, certain rejoinders to their objection, right? We would probably be able to fall back on something like a moral argument and say, okay, at the end of the day, no matter what response I give, Mr. Atheist, can you even justify your moral indignation given your worldview, right? Yeah. So it's really nice and handy that you can pose this objection to me, but on what grounds are you standing to even make such an objection? When you look down, you'll realize you're actually standing on my front yard. Right. So there are some of those objections that are those rejoinders that you and I would likely share, just because they're kind of theory neutral, Absolutely. They're theology neutral, that we would go along with.
Zacharias has a great chapter in this dealing with that.
Yeah. But there are other aspects of it where we would differ, right? So typically, what you're not going to hear from someone of my theological perspective is something like a free will defense. Okay. So we may say it could be the case that some version of freedom is a morally sufficient reason that God might allow certain evils, right? I said that very specifically because it's going to be it's a different type of defense, right? So one area where I'm uncomfortable, or actually sometimes I side with the atheist, is I don't think free will is a sufficient response in and of itself, right? Because I often feel myself siding with the atheist and saying, okay, but it's not simply that free will is allowed, it's that the outcome of free will is allowed, right? So it may be the case that I could have freedom such that I could try to shoot somebody, but maybe God frustrates my choice every single time. I could go shooting at the range and be just fine. I could shoot at watermelons and be just fine. But the instant I point a gun and shoot a bullet at a person, it turns into a marshmallow, right? So it may be the case that my freedom could be upheld, but that's not actually sufficient for why there's evil in the world, right? So there's other things. So I'm sure you have thoughts about that. I'm not actually trying to present that as an argument, but what I'm trying to say is there are other arguments that a Reformed person is going to give as the primary reason, and the main primary reason is simply that God is sovereign and holy and righteous and just, and does everything to His glory. And so it may be the case that the morally sufficient reason for allowing the evil He does is that it brings God maximal glory. That's not always an easy pill to swallow as an apologetic, because typically as apologists, we want to make God sound as fair and equitable and nice as possible. And the atheist is going to say, oh, well, that makes God sound like a narcissist. Right? It makes so God is doing these evil things just to get Himself glory. And at the end of the day, I'm going to say, yeah, he is. And and given the nature of God, that is a morally sufficient reason for allow it. If I was doing that as another human, as another image bearer, kind of horizontally to other people, causing harm to get myself praise, that would be bad, because I am ontologically identical to those other people. I am a creature just like they are. I'm not the transcendent, all holy, all righteous, all just, sovereign creator of all things.
Right. And you're not worthy of glory by
difference. Sorry, say that again?
I'd say God by definition is worthy of glory. We're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's for the example I gave, I wrote a paper on this called Shall Not the Judge of All the Earth Do What Is Just, right? It's based on Genesis 18, where God comes down to Abraham and says, look, these cities of the plain have done wickedness, and I'm going to destroy them. And Abraham, well, if there were 50 of them, would you destroy it? And God says, for the sake of 50 righteous, I wouldn't. Well, if there was 40, well, for the sake of 40, I wouldn't. And he gets them all the way down to 10, and then the conversation stops. Really, the implication as you go through the narrative is that even for the sake of one, right, Lot, God wouldn't spare the city. But through the narrative, you realize that even Lot isn't righteous, and Lot is only spared because of the intercession of Abraham, and so that there's naturally none righteous in the valleys of the plain. And so yet here you have God inflicting destruction on people for his own glory and his own justice, and to bring righteous retribution against these people. And we would look at that and say, okay, but I mean, if I was a president or something, I couldn't go and just obliterate a nation just because they were doing bad things that I don't like, right? That would make me a genocidal maniac. But I'm not God. Right? I have certain moral obligations to other humans that God doesn't have moral obligations, right? There's no external authority obliging God to act in certain ways. God just acts righteously in accord with his nature, whereas I'm obliged to be a respecter of persons because I am a human. I have certain horizontal obligations, whereas God has no horizontal obligations because there are none like him.
Sure. Also, to that point, I mean, within the analogy, like, God isn't even only, say, inflicting his justice on a particular group of people just because they're doing bad things. I mean, there's two things. So the president, for example, wouldn't just go wage war on a nation for just because he didn't like the way they behaved to each other. But like, if they attacked his own people that he was responsible for protecting, well, then yes, he would have warrant to do that. Or if they threatened the White House and his life directly, he would have warrant to do that. And so, yes, when people sin, not only are they sinning on behalf of God's other creatures, maybe they're killing God's people, in which case God is avenging his own people, but also when they sin, they're sinning against their own makers, so they are offending God directly. So he does have a right to take justice on that.
Yep, absolutely. That's absolutely right. But to go along with this, right? So that's a very long way to say that freedom, the concept of free will, plays a very different role in Reformed theology than it does in non-Reformed theology, right? So, you say I know you're a Molinist, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't know if you're an Arminian or a Provisionist or Wesleyan. I mean, I don't know what your soteriological views are, but so when I say non-Calvinist, I'm not trying to say you're a common problem among Calvinists is they think all non-Calvinists are Arminians, which is just false.
Right.
And they think all Arminians are the same, which is also false. But what I say that is that in these non-Calvinist systems, with the exception of maybe Lutheranism, free will just plays a different position on the field, so to speak. It has a different, it could be, and it's a different thing, right? So typically in non-Reformed views, with the exception of, again, Lutheranism, and in Reformed or historic Arminianism, which a bunch of my Calvinist friends are now rolling over and screaming at their screen for me to say Reformed Arminians. But if you understand historical theology, historical Arminians were not the Arminians of today. If you're in kind of these semi or Augustinian traditions, freedom just is not the same concept. It's not the same thing. And so it has a different utility within our theology and within our apologetic. And so that's why I thought it'd be interesting to have this conversation with you, because I've always appreciated, again, your contribution in the Youth Empire, and then also on your own show. And I thought we'd be able to have a very interesting discussion about the what freedom is and the role of it, and then also have some if we have time, have some interesting conversation about Molinism as well, since I know you affirm or at least tentatively affirm Molinism. So.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. So with respect to the terms like Arminianism or these kinds of things, I don't know enough about the terms to affirm one of them specifically. I am comfortable enough with Molinism to affirm Molinism. So I might just say, for the sake of the discussion, I'm Molinist.
Which is fine. We don't have to get into like soteriology, like the nature of the atonement and things like that, which really is going to be a big differentiator between, even between semi-Augustinian views like Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Reformed or historic Arminianism. We don't have to go that far into the weeds.
Yeah. Yeah. So just going back to the free will defense for the problem of suffering. So I would agree that in and of itself, just by itself, I wouldn't say, well, God allowed freedom, and so then there's just all this evil in the world, and so, tough, nuggets, so to speak. I would say a lot of things. I would say, yes, God has a purpose, and his purpose is to have a genuine love relationship with his creation. And so for it to be a genuine love relationship, it has to be freely chosen instead of just kind of pre-programmed in like a robot, so to speak. I know you don't believe that, but but that would be part of it. And then another part of it, I would say, would be the soul building aspect of it. And that comes with, where he said all the bullets could be turned into marshmallows. Well, so God not only allows the freedom, but he also allows suffering to enter the universe through freedom, because there are certain virtues that are developed in creatures by going through shades of suffering. And then that gets led into certain beliefs I have about heaven, how it can be possible that we are free in heaven and there not be suffering. It's because we've learned from suffering to such a degree, and we'll have a transformed nature and so on. But without getting into all that, I wouldn't say it's just he allows freedom and that's the explanation for evil. I'd say it's also soul building, things like wanting a genuine relationship with his creatures. And I think that serves two functions. Where I want to agree with you is I think that all of that does bring God glory. The fact that we choose to have a relationship with him, that we become more mature and appreciative of his grace in that relationship, and all of that, and our fellowship with him brings him glory. And then at the same time, it's he is able to share his love with his creation.
Yeah. So I'm far more sympathetic with something like, although again, in a Reformed world, we're going to state it a little bit differently. We're going to emphasize different aspects, but I'm far more sympathetic to a soul building theodicy, right? Because I believe in the promise of Romans 8, that God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose, right? I think that part of what we are predestined for within Reformed terms, part of what we are predestined to is conformity to the image of the Son, right? So I think what we typically in philosophical terms call soul building, in theological terms we call sanctification. I'm perfectly fine. I'm much more sympathetic to that as a theodicy, or as a defeater for the problem of evil and suffering. I'm sure you saw my grimace though, when
because in order to talk to the audience, I'm looking at the camera. If I want to look at you, I have to look at the computer.
Okay. The funny thing is, so I think I grimaced. I felt myself grimace, and then you said, "I know you don't agree with me." So perfect timing. Then I thought you were looking at me. I have to look at you. Actually, I have to look over here, which also looks like I'm up. But when you said one, okay, so I'm trying to think of a good way to kind of jump into this, right? So when you say something like God desires a relationship, a true loving relationship, right? And that requires freedom. Here, I'm going to say yes, but no. It depends on what you mean by freedom. If you mean libertarian freedom, right? Whereby by libertarian freedom, we mean something like the ability to do other than what you actually do. Right? I don't think a libertarian has to affirm a principle of alternative possibilities.
Right.
Although most do, and even when they say they don't, a lot of times implicitly they'll fall back on it. But I'm not going to hold their feet to that fire, because I know a lot of them, like Bill Craig, will say, okay, well, sometimes it applies, but sometimes not, which is fine. It's respectable. I get it. But what I'm going to say is, okay, but we have a clear counterexample to this, right? So if libertarian freedom is at the bare minimum the ability to do other than what you actually do, right? So you have counterfactual freedom. We have a clear example where this is not the case, right? And that's the persons of the Godhead, right? The persons of the Godhead are in an eternal loving state that could not be otherwise. right? Because if you're going to say it could be otherwise, you're going to have to implicitly deny immutability, which is that God cannot change, because you'd have to say that it's possible for them to change, but then that it's impossible for them to change, which is a contradiction.
Right.
It would also seem to undermine impeccability, because it seems like the perfectly holy thing to do is inner Trinitarian love. So impeccability is that God cannot do anything that is less than perfectly righteous. But if it's possible for one of the persons to not love God, because if you have to have libertarian freedom for there to be true love, then it is the case that it's possible for one of them to not be impeccable and to freely choose not to love the other ones. So you might want to soften it and say, okay, but they wouldn't. Okay, even if I grant that they wouldn't, you're still saying it's possible. It's a metaphysically possible thing that could happen, which just is a denial of immutability, which is that God, it's not a possibility for God to change in his essential nature, right? So I'm just going to say, if the argument is that in order for there to be true love, libertarian freedom has to exist, I'm just going to say, in principle, that's false. In practical case, that may always be the case, but you can't make that as a principled statement, defense of libertarian freedom, or objection to some type of determinism. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So there was something I wanted to go back to and I forgot it. Oh, right, the principle of alternative possibilities. So now I do believe in the principle of alternative possibilities, but I've heard it said, and I'm inclined to agree with it, that that's not necessary in order to maintain libertarian free will. What's necessary to maintain libertarian free will is essentially that I'm the source of the choices I make without something outside of me determining or forcing the choice for me.
Right.
And so I maintain that. Now, with regard to God, so for example, yes, I do agree that, for example, God can't choose to be only some loving or only finitely loving, or he can't choose to be 4 persons or 2 persons, things like that. Now, where I would want to make a distinction is, and here I do think, and you might disagree with me on this, I do think God does have a principle of alternative possibilities, in the sense that, for example, he could have chosen to create a world in which he has creatures that he shares his love, or he could have chosen to just remain timelessly in the Trinity and in that love relationship. And I think the two, you can make an argument that they're equal goods, to where God could have chosen those things. As far as the God not having the ability to be unloving, I think because God is infinitely loving and he is the paradigm of love, that's a genuine love that comes out of this relationship, and it is kind of necessitated by the relationship, but there's nothing outside of God determining that he love himself. Now, as far as creatures, if God creates creatures, and let's say he wasn't going to give them the option to not love him, I'm not necessarily sure he could do that without, let's say, giving that person an infinite amount of love, or making that person infinitely loving. But of course, I think you and I would agree this is a contradiction. You can't give a finite creature like an infinite attribute of love. And insofar as a finite creature is going to have a finite capacity for love, that's going to either entail that there's some capacity for them not to love. If it's finite capacity to love, there's going to be some ability in there not to love. And so if there's going to be a necessity for a finite creature with a finite capacity for love to love God, he would have to force it or determine it in some way, if he's not going to allow the opposite, for them to turn away from him.
Yeah. Let me give a couple thoughts, because that's a lot of ground to cover. So first, I agree with you. I think I would word some things different. So I'm
kind of going off the cuff here, so you'll have to forgive things.
We're having it. This isn't a formal debate.
Yeah.
You know, you have coffee. I have sparkling. I think coffee. Maybe I can't smell it from here.
Water. Enough in the evening to have some things.
So I have over the years become uncomfortable talking about infinity of attributes. I know what people mean when they say it. No, I'm much more comfortable. I'm not I'm not a Thomist, but I'm much more comfortable talking about the perfection of his attributes.
And you and I would actually be in a lot of agreement there, because infinite can sometimes entail quantity when we're really not talking about that.
Exactly right. So I'm much more talking about that God is perfect in love than infinite in love. Because partly because I know what perfect in love means, I'm not exactly sure what it would even mean to be infinite in love, because infinite isn't a quantity. So if you mean it qualitatively, then you just mean the same thing that we mean when we say perfect. If you mean it quantitatively, then I don't know what that means. So that's just a nuance. So if I say perfect later, I essentially mean the same thing that you just said. The other thing is, I should caveat this by saying I actually believe that God is the only creature that has something approximately close to what people call libertarian freedom.
Okay.
However, I caveat it, and interesting enough, I caveat it. Our mutual friend, Tim, right? Tim Stratton. Which I don't know if he messaged you about the image that you used, which was actually him and I at ETS.
No, I sent it to him though. Couldn't resist.
Hilarious. But he actually says, okay, but he modifies libertarian freedom into limited libertarian freedom. That modification to limited libertarian freedom, I think, so I think I think God is the only being that would have limited libertarian freedom. Limited libertarian freedom is I'm sufficiently free to choose. Nothing is determining my choice. Well, I shouldn't say me. Nothing is determining God's choice, but God still cannot choose contrary to his own nature.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? So nature is a causally determinative condition of the choices, even if it doesn't determine the specific choice that you have, right? He's going to want to say that humans have that same freedom for reasons we'll get into. I don't think humans have that type of freedom, but I'm very comfortable saying God has that type of freedom. However, that limited part of it is precisely why I would make the argument that true love isn't, that libertarian freedom isn't required for true love. Libertarian freedom, I don't think, is even required for true love, because I think that the love that the persons of the Trinity have with each other is essential. I think it's part of the divine nature to be Trinitarian. And so, like I said, it's not merely that there are no other possibilities for one person of the Trinity to choose from, right? So it's not merely that they have libertarian freedom, but in this one case, there's no principle of alternative possibilities. It's the case that by nature, the Godhead loves each other in a covenant love. So I just think that it's very clear that we have an example of true love not requiring any type of freedom whatsoever. It just is part of the essential nature, God as love, God as the essential attributes for the three persons of the Trinity to exist eternally in perfect love with each other. It's not a choice that they make. It's part of the essential nature. So that's where I would come back and say, I agree with actually much of what you said, because again, I think that God has some form of libertarian freedom, albeit limited, but that's not the condition that makes them the inner Trinitarian love. So I would say that even bringing in the libertarian freedom of God isn't sufficient to overcome my objection that true love isn't, or libertarian freedom isn't needed for true love. Because bringing up libertarian freedom in the Godhead isn't the sufficient attribute for the love within the Godhead.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. The reason I think it's different for humans is because I think with God, because part of his essential nature is that he's perfect in love, and so love can be perfected in him, that you don't need to say, give him the option to not love himself in order for the love to be genuine. Right? I think the love is genuine, not because of the option, but because of the attribute of being perfect in love.
Right.
What I'm saying is, for humans, or let me say this, for a situation to be possible where you could not have the option to do otherwise, but the love also be genuine and real, it would have to be something like God's nature. When we're talking about humans, because love can't be perfected in a human, they can't have that attribute of perfect love, then I think with any kind of limited capacity for love, then that's when you have to have the option, you have to have the freedom to not do it in order for it to be genuine, if that makes sense.
It does. Here, I'd probably push back a little bit on your biblical anthropology, and say, well, if libertarian freedom is true for humans, right? If we kind of move out of the realm of the divine nature and move into the creaturely realm of humans, if libertarian freedom is true, it's not the case that we're limited in love, because love then becomes love. It's kind of cliche, but love becomes a choice, right? It's not an attribute of ours, right? So we're not limited in love. It's the fact that we're sinful, and so therefore we don't always love as we should. But like when in the resurrection, we're not going to be limited in love. We will just always choose the loving thing because we'll be in a glorified state. So our nature, and that's to say, our nature will actually determine the types of decisions that we make, right? So if I'm glorified, I will make the maximally loving decisions because I won't be a slave to sin anymore, as I am now, right? As I am now, sin taints everything that I do. So even loving acts that I do are tainted by sin. Right? This is why Paul can say, even my most righteous deeds are but filthy menstrual rags, right? So even the most loving thing that I do is still unrighteous. Mm-hmm. So our nature, our fallen nature, our enslavement to sin and bondage, even though we're free in Christ, we still often choose, as Paul says, we choose the things that we do not want to do, right? I do the very thing that I don't want to do because I perceive a law of death within me, right? So there's a very real sense where my nature, I'm currently, being transformed into the image of Christ, but my nature, there's still, as Paul says, a principle of death within my members, is still, I'm still imperfect in love because I choose to be. Whereas in heaven, my nature will be different, and therefore I will choose not to be. So maybe we can put it this way. When it comes to determinism, right? When it comes to compatibilism, a compatibilist, which most Calvinists are, is the position that God can exhaustively determine all things, and we're sufficiently free in a sense that we are morally responsible for our actions. Our involvement in our actions are still praiseworthy and blameworthy. Why? Because we're still doing the very things we want to do, right? All things being equal, if you rewound the tape a million times, I would choose to do the same things as long as all conditions were identical, because it's the thing that I want to do by nature. It's my greatest desire to do that, right? That's compatibilism, that God can determine it, and we are morally responsible and free because we do the thing. I choose to do what I want to do, even if I'm not choosing, even if I don't have the freedom to do what I don't want to do. The libertarian is what's called an incompatibilist. The incompatibilist, by the way, we talked about this before the show, a libertarian and a hyper-Calvinist are both incompatibilists. They're two sides of the same coin, right? A hyper-Calvinist and a libertarian both believe that determinism and freedom, because they both define freedom as libertarian freedom only, they both think those two things are incompatible. It's just that the hyper-Calvinist affirms determinism and the libertarian affirms the libertarian freedom, right? So they are two sides of the same coin, right? They look at it and they're going to say, well, in order for someone to be morally responsible, they have to have this certain kind of freedom where they could choose other than what they choose, whether or not that's an actual alternative possibility, whether or not it's because they are the source that's determining it, whatever it is, whatever the reason is, this one thing has to be true. They have to have what's called categorical ability. So there's two different types of ability, and I'll stop after this because I'm sure you have a bunch of questions. But I just want to get these terms in place before we talk about it. So when we talk, I can say, well, what do you mean by? Do you mean categorical or what's called conditional? So you have these two types of ability. You have categorical ability, which is basically counterfactual ability. It's the ability to do categorically something else, right? You have the ability to do other than the thing you do, right? So if I choose X, categorical ability is the ability to choose not X, right? That's categorical ability. The Reformed theologian, and by the way, the majority of philosophers, because the majority of philosophers are compatibilists as well, because we don't think that categorical ability is the necessary condition for moral responsibility. We're going to say conditional ability is a necessary, it may not be a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. Conditional ability is the ability to do what you want to do, right? So it's all things being equal. So if you rewind the tape, as long as you didn't change anything, I may choose to do the same thing, but it's the thing that I want to do. I intend to. There's no one out there manipulating or forcing or drugging, right? This is why the puppets, the robots, the machines, all that kind of stuff are really straw mans of the incompatibilist position, right? Because we're going to say, well, as long as I am doing what I want to do, all things being equal, then I'm morally responsible for what I do. It may be the case that the only reason I have this nature is because of causal conditions A, B, C, and D. It may be the case that the only reason I have these certain tastes and preferences and proclivities is because of nature and nurture, and I didn't choose any of those things. But as long as, as long as I have reason-responsive capabilities and I'm choosing to do the thing that I want to do, then I'm morally responsible. As long as I'm not being drugged, manipulated, coerced, threatened, forced against my will, and by against my will, I mean doing something other than what I want, then I'm free. And I'm morally responsible. Right? So that those two different understandings of ability are very, very important, because when we start getting into these discussions, you'll notice, and it'll come up as we talk these things. I may stop you a few times and say, what do you mean? Do you mean categorical or conditional? Right. Because if you mean categorical, you need to prove that, right? You can't assume it. Everyone agrees conditional ability, right? We all agree on that, right? I'm sure hearing that, you're like, yeah, well, I mean, of course, you can't be forced. Of course, you have to be able to do what you want to do. The libertarian just wants to add this additional necessary condition of categorical ability, but without demonstrating it. And so if you build it in, then you're begging the question of libertarian freedom. And I'm simply not going to be able to go with you down that road because I don't agree with that. And you can't assume it, you need to prove it. And so that really is, I think, one of the reasons why a lot of these conversations go past each other, because we both use the terms freedom. We both use the term ability. We both use the term choose, but the libertarian means categorical and the compatibilist means conditional. And so we just don't mean the same thing, but we never clarify that. So we talk past each other.
Okay. So I want to come back to that, but I want to make one reference, because I think I had misspoke. So I want to make a reference back to what we were saying, talking about God, being capable of loving without having the alternative option. So if I may have misspoke if I said like we have, say, an attribute of loving. I should have said like we have a finite capacity. Maybe a capacity would have been a better word for me to use. And so I do think there is something like, if humans have a finite capacity, there does seem to me to have to be something of the ability to choose otherwise in order for the love to be genuine. But maybe I don't need that. I might just be able to say that in God's case, because there's nothing outside of him that determines that his nature is all loving, that he is the source of that love, then yes, it's genuine love. But with a human, because that source would essentially have to come from the outside, whether God creates us to have a certain nature that maybe chooses to love or not, that might be a relevant difference. So before I go on to the other stuff you said, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, so that actually is something that I bring up quite a bit when I'm talking to libertarians, right? So they'll bring up source, right? Kind of this idea of sourcehood, right? So one of the things that I also try to do is say, okay, philosophy is great, and we've done a lot of philosophy, and we'll continue to do a lot. I'm not like anti-philosophy, right? But our philosophy should be in accord with our biblical theology, right? So it's such that if we come up with a position that contradicts the clear teaching of Scripture, or an exegetically responsible position from Scripture, right? Because I don't typically want to go back to well, that's just what it's just the plain meaning. Don't you just agree? But just by reading, right? That's never a convincing position. But there are exegetically responsible positions, even if there are multiple within the same, right? There may be 2 or 3 of them that are exegetically responsible. But if we take a position that is contrary to any exegetically responsible position, then that philosophy just has to be false, or that something has gone off the rails at some point for that position. I think you would agree with me, right? So, I'm gonna when this type of thing comes up and sourcehood comes up, I'm gonna say, okay, but we realize that in biblical theology, our biblical anthropology is we don't determine our nature. We don't I don't determine my nature. I don't determine my soul. I don't determine my attributes, my place of birth, my parentage, my heritage, my Psalms tell neither you or I are open theists. Psalm tells us that he has preordained all the days of our lives. He's preordained the days of our death. All of these types of things, such that when a libertarian says, as long as I'm the source, then I'm free, right? And I'm going to say, okay, but you didn't choose any of those aspects, right? When I push on libertarians, typically what I find is a very kind of disjointed anthropology. So I say, okay, well, what do you mean when you say you choose? Because they're going to deny that my nature determines my choice, right? Because they don't want to be compatibilists, right? So it can't be my nature, right? Well, it can't be my body. It can't be my emotions, right? It can't be my mind, right? None of these constituent parts can be causally determinative of what you choose, because otherwise you wouldn't have libertarian freedom, right? So then the question that I have for sourcehood advocates is, then at that point, I don't know what you mean when you say, as long as I'm the source, because at the end of the day, you have a composition problem that none of your attributes actually causally determine your outcome. So it is the case that you're the source, but it's the case that none of you is the source. Because to avoid determinism, they need to say that my will, my choice, wasn't causally determined by anything prior to that choice, which includes the constituent parts of my nature. So it gets to this point. It's kind of like the Grim Reaper paradox, where it is the case that John is dead, but it's not the case that any Grim Reaper killed him. So it is the case that I'm the choice of my outcome, but it's not the case that any part of me made that choice. So when it comes to sourcehood, a lot of times I just don't even know what that. I don't know what that entails, because the instant you want to ground what it is in myself as a source, you seemingly have granted some form of determinism, because let me lay, before you respond, I'll give you a chance to respond, but let me lay one presupposition on the table if you want to attack that presupposition. I'm granting that I'm giving a presupposition, and that is, I'm not a doxastic voluntarist. I don't think we choose our belief. I think that indirect doxastic voluntarism is partially true, and I think doxastic involuntarism is partially true. I think we can And by that, we can put ourselves in positions to inculcate certain beliefs. That's indirect doxastic voluntarism. And I think sometimes we just flat out aren't even aware, don't choose, don't do anything, and we inculcate beliefs. That's doxastic involuntarism. I think those two things account for our beliefs, or what occurs in our minds, our emotions, our wills, all that kind of stuff. If we don't choose, if we don't directly cause our beliefs, our emotions, all that kind of stuff, then I think my argument follows, where I'm not actually the causal condition of those aspects, those constituent parts of myself that then ground sourcehood. Does that make sense?
Yes. I won't respond to that directly. I'll ask after I give an initial response. I'll ask more about that because that's the first time I'm hearing of that. So I don't want to say anything just off the cuff about it. So there were a couple of things there, and I'm gonna try not to be all over the place, but it's kind of just all bouncing around in my head. So I apologize for.
They're complex. It's a complex conversation, and there's 100 different roads in and out. So it's
fine. So I think the probably the center of this is going to be the source thing that you just mentioned, because you made the distinction between categorical and conditional.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the categorical had more to do with the principle of alternative possibilities, whereas the conditional had to do with, well, I choose what I want. Am I fairly okay so far?
Sort of, but no. So it may be the case that the principle of alternative possibilities is just 1,000% false. Categorical ability would still apply, because categorical ability is just the counterfactual ability to do other than what I in fact do. And yeah, so even if there was metaphysically no other possibility to do something, having the ability to do that, if there were those things, is still the categorical ability, right? So it's not identical with the principle of alternative possibilities. In fact, the principle of alternative possibilities, I think, could be false, and categorical ability would still be something that the libertarian would need to affirm. Although I think most libertarians, I think this came up in one of the questions, I think most libertarian free will advocates would say that the principle of alternative possibility either is true or is at least true in some cases. So, I don't know any libertarian who just denies the principle of alternative possibility. I don't know. I mean, I'm a compatibilist, and I don't flat out deny the principle of alternative possibility. So, I don't think but I don't think that the categorical ability is identical with or necessitates a principle of alternative possibility. Does that help?
It does, and I'll try to come back to that. So there was a couple of things, and I'm not sure I'm seeing a difference, because I think early on you made the distinction between, well, I'm not a hyper-Calvinist, because then hyper-Calvinists and determinists are kind of two sides of the same coin. But the way you've defined compatibilism, I'm not sure it would be a sufficient difference between those two things. And the reason is because I think even the hard determinists would say something like, well, yeah, you think you're choosing what you want, but then even your wants are kind of determined. And so I'm also not sure that on compatibilism, moral responsibility is a thing, because you might say, well, you're morally responsible because you still did what you wanted to do. My problem is, though, if what you wanted to do was determined, then there's not a reasonable difference between forcing you to do the thing and then forcing you to want to do the thing, and then you didn't have an ability to not do what you wanted to do. So you said the source or the self or nature, and I wrote that down to kind of in this principle of alternative possibilities, which might say, well, let's say you choose to eat the cake because you want to eat the cake, right? You want to eat the cake, and then you choose to eat the cake. But then my question is going to be, well, what happens when there's two things you want equally as much? Like maybe you want the cake equally as much as you want the cookies, but you don't have enough room in your stomach to do both. So you still have to choose one. And then I'm also not going to say, and this is why I define libertarian free will the way I do, although I don't really like the definition as much anymore as I used to. But I do think that your nature influences what you do. So yeah, I mean, for example, what I'm going to choose to eat, there's going to be an influence based on my taste buds. If I have a desire to, say, lose weight or rather gain muscle, there's going to be all these influences. And then, as you point out, nature and nurture, there's going to be all these influences. I do believe that I still have a will that can go against my influences if that's what I chose to do. So maybe I have I have the proclivity to want to choose the thing, but let's say I want to lose weight. Well, I can fight against that because I have a will. And so this is where I do want to say that there has to be, if there's a distinction in the source. And so I do think the source of the choice is ultimately my will. And I think if the source is the nature, then to me, it's not a relevant difference between me being forced to choose a thing and being forced to have a nature in which I can't choose in contrary with it. And one last thing I might say about this is, for example, I think we have a range of options that's compatible with our nature that we could choose from. And so one of the examples I often give is I can't choose to jump 60 feet in the air, or I can't choose to flap my arms and take off flying, but I can will to do those things. And that's why I think the will is the source and not necessarily the nature, because I can will to flap it's just not going to work because I'm not physically capable of doing that. But it's the very fact that I can will something other than my nature tells me that, okay, but once I'm within the parameters of my nature, I do have the will to be able to choose these different things. And that's why I do think the principle of alternative possibilities comes in. And then to your point about proving that that's the case, I don't know that we can have proof in the sense, I can't go back in time and then observe myself having chose something differently. But I do think it might fall into the same kind of intuitive evidence that just as I intuit that I freely chose to pour water into this mug, I can intuit that, well, maybe I was feeling, maybe I wanted to, pour orange soda in here, that I could have done that. So I know that's kind of a barrage of things, and I hope it's been relatively clear.
It is, and I think I can answer in a way that ties it all together, right? So, reasonably together. I think I can combine those 5 things into 2 or 3 things. First, you can always have cake and cookies. Just your stomach's big enough. But second, what you're getting at is the difference between the faculty of the will to choose to do something and my ability to achieve it, right? So I have the faculty to choose to flap my arms like a bird, but I don't have the ability to fly like a bird. And then you talk about sourcehood. The will just is the thing that chooses. Again, here I'm gonna push back philosophically and biblically on that, and I'm gonna say, okay, but the will, when you think about the will, when you say, okay, well, I desired water over orange soda, right? Which is a terrible decision to make, by the way. Orange soda is fantastic. Or cactus cooler, which
I'm trying to stay hydrated the best I can.
But it's just not the case, I think, that your will actually makes that determination. Your will just is the self-choosing, right? So it's not that your will has a mind of its own and takes on this other information and says, okay, thanks mind, thanks emotions, thanks nature, thanks taste, thanks all for your input. Now I'm the will, I'm going to take all that and I'm going to decide. Right? The will just is your capacity to choose. The will is a function of the self. It's not a self in and of itself. Right? So then when you say, okay, well, I choose, I have free will. Well, if it's the will, the self actually doesn't have free will because the self then becomes something else. This is why I said I normally push back and say, I don't know when on these sourcehood views, I don't know what you mean when you say the self chooses, because either the will is hermetically sealed off from everything that we in every other case think is constitutive of a person, or it's no longer libertarian because all of those things that are constitutive of a person determine the choice, right? So I think you made the only maneuver you could make, which is that in order to maintain libertarian freedom, which is that you isolate the will. But once you've done that, I don't even think the self chooses anymore, because now your intellect isn't caused right? So think of Tim Stratton's free thinking argument, right? If you don't have freedom, you can't think freely. Well, if that's the case, that my will is choosing, then my will is hermetically sealed off from my intellect. My intellect isn't actually freely doing anything. My will is now the thing that is doing everything. So will now becomes the summum bonum, the sine qua non of what a self is, which I think is not only demonstrably false, but I think way too reductive. But let me.
Well, can I come in real quick?
Yeah.
Just because, I don't want it to continue down the lines. If I insinuate that there's like a will apart from the self or apart from the mind, I did not mean to put that forward at all. I would say I have a will, just like I have a nature and I have desires and I have influences. But I would say because I have a will, I have the ability to choose to go in line with my desires or choose to not go in line with my desires, or I even have a choice between options that are all within my desires.
Well, so two things. So what you've just said is your will actually then just is a function, right? It's like sight or hearing or taste, right? It's a function of what the self does, right? But then
I wouldn't use that language because I think that would just be determinism. The same way that determinists would say, well,
that's some of my point. The instant you bring the will back under the umbrella of the self, determinism is really hard to avoid. But then notice you said, I kind of told you that I would do this. You said, well, that just means I have the ability to choose other than. Okay, do you mean categorical ability? If so, you're begging the question then. Or do you mean conditional ability? Right? So you can't say, because categorical ability is identical with libertarian freedom. So you can't say I have libertarian freedom because I have categorical ability. Otherwise, you're saying I have libertarian freedom because I have libertarian freedom, which that's just to beg the question of the thing we're talking about. So that doesn't actually add any robustness to your case, right? It'd be like me saying, well, I'm a compatibilist because compatibilism is true.
Well, no, fair enough. But the point I think I did make an intuitive argument towards that. And
that's what I was going to address next. So the intuitive argument, because when you say that, right, I'm simply going to say that that because you have, and I don't mean this maliciously. I don't think you're being dishonest or anything like that. But I think
I'm unpracticed in this kind of dialogue.
That's why we're having these conversations.
Mistakes are inevitable.
Yeah. So I think because you've begged the question of that position, it then is the framework that you interpret things. So when you say I have the intuition then that I'm free, right? So you have the intuition of, well, I have chocolate cake or I have going into exercise, right? I can fight my greatest desire to eat chocolate cake and I can go exercise, right? Therefore, I have the intuitive warrant to believe that I have libertarian freedom. I'm going to push back and I'm going to say, I don't think your intuition tells you that. I think your intuition tells you, and I don't mean this in that, let me tell you what you actually believe.
No, I know. I'm not making that face because I'm like questioning you. I make that face when I get more interested or I'm trying to pay attention.
So there's all these, there's actually, it's funny because in these conversations, there are a lot of claims that made, kind of the folk perspective, the intuition is that we have libertarian freedom. That's actually not the case. There's been a whole bunch of studies actually done on this, on kind of experimental psychology and philosophy, showing that actually the folk intuition is compatibilistic, that as long as we're not forced, we're free. And even when given compatibilistic conditions, people intuit that they're still free and morally responsible. So what happens is I would simply say, all we're doing is talking about things with different language, but because your framework is libertarian, you're interpreting it that way. So imagine I said, okay, you have a strong, your strongest presenting desire is to eat the chocolate cake. By presenting desire, I mean the one that makes you salivate the most, the one that you feel a tug for the most in your heart of hearts, right?
Right.
In kind of in philosophical traditions and in Reformed theological traditions, that's not what we mean by strongest desire, right? Your strongest desire is the thing that you want to do existentially the most, right? So it may be the case that your strongest presenting desire is to eat the chocolate cake, but your strongest overall desire is to stay healthy,
right,
and not die at a young age. And so you choose not to eat the chocolate cake. It's not that you have chosen against your will. It's that your will has been determined by your strongest desire, and you choose that. All that shows is that your strongest desire actually wasn't to eat the chocolate cake. Your strongest desire was to maintain, you look like you have a relatively good physique. You're to maintain that, to be healthy, right? Whatever those reasons are, that's actually your strongest desire. And your choice was to go with that, right? So so I would just push back and I would say, it's not actually the case that your intuition proves libertarianism, because your intuition your intuition is framework neutral. Once you pick a framework, your intuition can go either way, right? Because I have the intuition of, I go with my strongest desire because I think my strongest desire is the one that I want the most ultimately. You're going to say, well, my strongest desire, is I can go against my will and against my strongest desire, and I can choose something else, because you understand it in a libertarian categorical ability way. So I'm going to say your intuition just doesn't resolve that for you.
Yeah. So a couple of things. So I think the intuition, so I separated them, but I think one entails the other. So when I said, okay, I have this kind of intuition that I make free choices, and I think that's some evidence that I really am a being that makes free choices. Likewise, I have an intuition that I could have chosen otherwise with regards to certain things I did 5 minutes ago. And I think the first intuition entails the first, and if one is to negate if one is to negate the latter, to say, well, actually, you couldn't have chosen anything else 5 minutes ago than what you did chose, then I think my original intuition that I'm a being that makes free choices is false. And the reason is because, like, when...
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but really fast, before we go on, right? When you say, because I think we have the intuition that we're free, right? Because I think we're free so long as we're not forced. So I agree with your initial intuition that you're free.
Yes.
I'm going to say, I don't think, and I try not to psychologize, but I'm going to say, because I think we all share in humanity. And so I think we have this similar intuition in this experience. When I reflect on that experience, and I think unless you're having a very different human experience than I am, I don't think that I have the intuition that I could have done other than I've done. Because that's a very philosophically freighted thing. And I don't think intuition is that philosophical, right? I think that I have the intuition that I could have chosen it if I wanted to. Right? Do you see the difference between those two things? Right?
Well, yeah, but that's why I made a distinction earlier between, say, two equal desires for two separate choices, that maybe you can't do both at the same time.
I'm not sure those exist. So you would have to demonstrate that we could have exactly equal desires, right? I'm not sure that those exist for many reasons. But
Well, that's fair, but that would go back to something I kind of wanted to say earlier.
Yeah.
When you said, you were talking about, well, the common folk understanding isn't actually libertarian free will. It's people say, well, I'm free if I'm not forced. And then the common folk intuition is something like, well, I do make free choices and I'm morally responsible. My point would be, I don't think they are morally responsible or making free choices if they are forced to have a nature. And that's why I don't think there's a meaningful difference between saying, well, you're not forced to choose to go in line with your nature, but you are forced to have a certain nature. I don't think there's a meaningful distinction, because then if you don't have the ability to choose something in contrary to your nature, well, then being forced to have the nature is the same thing as being forced to do the thing. And just real quick, this ties into what you were saying about categorical. You when I said, oh, I think categorical is the principle of alternative possibilities, you said, well, not exactly. It's more something like, well, you could have chosen differently had you had a different nature. But I would want to think that both of us would agree with that. For example, me as a Molinist, I believe in counterfactual claims, but then I would think you would want to say, well, had God given me a different nature, of course I would choose different things, because that would go in line with that nature God gave me.
So let me clarify. Again, categorical ability is the ability, all things being equal, to have done other than I do. Conditional ability is the ability to have done otherwise had I wanted to do otherwise. Right? So that's why the folk intuition is generally, I have the ability to do otherwise had I wanted to do it. Nothing, I wasn't forced to do X. I wanted to do X. And so I chose X, right? Basically, the folk intuition isn't freighted with the philosophical baggage of why I choose what I choose. It's just that so long as I choose what I want to, I'm sufficiently free and I'm morally responsible. That, again, that doesn't mean that the folk intuition is what actually is the case and true. It's just that when you rely on the argument from intuition, I just don't think it is the case that intuition is in libertarian freedom. But let me,
can I make a, before you go on, can I make a real quick point to that? Because now I haven't read the studies. I don't think you're lying, obviously. So I'm going to assume those are the correct studies. But I would say that, to me, if we're going off those studies, there does seem to be something contradictory within it. Because insofar as, say, someone has let's say they have the moral, or they have the intuition that's like, say, I'm morally responsible and I freely choose things like I want. But then they don't have, for example, the intuition that, like, say, I could have done otherwise, all things being equal. Because I think those two things are contradictory. And the reason I do is because, I mean, I can mainly speak from personal experience, but I think a lot of people would agree with this kind of intuition, which is like, we torture ourselves over things we know we should have done and didn't do. And so I, daily struggle with this. I torture myself over, I can't believe I just wasted how many hours watching YouTube when I should have been writing for a video. Or, and we do these things all the time. And so now you might just want to say, well, listen, I mean, well, I'm just not convinced it's a sufficient answer to say, well, I mean, look, I know you're torturing yourself over this thing you know you should have done, all things being equal, but you didn't because you don't have that nature. To me, it's to say, well, no, we should work to want to make better choices, all things being equal. So even if I have a day tomorrow that was exactly like yesterday, I would choose to use this day more responsibly than I did the day prior.
Yeah. So let me clarify a little bit. So I don't rely on folk intuition as an argument, right?
I don't either. I do want to say that I do think that it is a window into reality, just like our five senses are. I think we have like intuitive senses. So I think it's a sense.
Yeah. So here's the thing. The reason why I brought up the studies, right? Again, it could be the case that folk intuition is wrong, right? We could have this, the folk intuition of conditional ability the folk intuition is that in all of these cases where conditional ability is applied in compatibilistic way, where something is determined, but as long as someone isn't forced, they're morally responsible, right? That's the overwhelming outcome of all these studies, right? the folk that just is the folk intuition, that you're morally responsible, even if you're determined, as long as you're not forced. Right? So the only reason I bring that up is because when someone wants to defend libertarian freedom and contra-causal choice and categorical ability and say that is what the folk intuition is, I just say it's not what the folk intuition is, actually.
Sure.
Right? You're appealing to something that just isn't the case. So I bring it up as a rejoinder to that as a support.
Oh, look, fair enough.
Right? But let me try to add one more piece of clarity, and then I want to go into biblical theological reasons, and then I'm sure there are people that want to talk about things. So,
sure.
One, you had brought up a very interesting point, which I want to make a clarification on, right? So you said, okay, it seems to me that compatibilism and hyper-Calvinism or hard determinism are, at the end of the day, and kind of in the final analysis, indistinguishable, right? Because if I don't choose my nature, but my nature determines my choice, I'm still not sufficiently responsible, right? And you said, okay, but hard determinism, like at the end of the day, they just collapse into the same thing. Let me address that very quickly. Well, as quickly as I can. It might take 2 minutes.
Yeah, no, take your time. That's fine. Or at the very least, I would say they result in the same kind of thing. But yeah.
Yeah. So let me at least try to untangle that Gordian knot a little bit. Mm-hmm. First of all, it's always a funny thing when people say, oh, well, at the end of the day, compatibilism just resolves into determinism. Well, yeah, I mean, compatibilism is determinism. It's just the view that a certain kind of determinism and a certain kind of freedom are compatible with each other. Both can be true, right? So it just is. Saying compatibilism is determinism is just as true as saying compatibilism is freedom. Right? Because it affirms both of them as true, or both of them as at least someone could be a compatibilist and still not think determinism is true, right? They just think that those views are compatible, right? That one doesn't necessitate the falsehood of the other, right? A hard determinist isn't a compatibilist, even though they're a determinist, right? But compatibilists and hard determinists are both determinists. One is a soft determinist, in that we think determinism is compatible with moral responsibility and freedom. A hard determinist is a determinist. They just think it's incompatible with freedom and moral responsibility. A hard determinist, like a hyper-Calvinist, is going to say, we're morally responsible simply because God says that we are, and that's it. If God says I'm guilty, then I'm guilty. There's no morally sufficient reason for me to be morally responsible. God has just said I'm guilty, so I'm guilty, right? That's a hard determinism.
Yeah.
Okay. When we talk about hard determinism also affirms what's called divine causality or divine causalism. Divine causalism is the view that God is the immediate cause for the truth of something within his creation, right? So this actual... That there's not categorical ability, but there's not even conditional ability, right? Because on divine causalism, I am forced to do what I choose to do, right? So it just is the case that God has caused me to choose the cake over not the cake, and has caused me to pick that, right? My will, I don't have, because remember, they're hard determinists. I don't have a will. I don't have free will on their view, right? Determinism is causative on hard determinism. On soft determinism, on compatibilism, determinism is not causative, right? And this will go into Molinism here in a second. If I'm determined to do something, I may be determined to do it, but in secondary or soft or in weak, philosophically weak, not like wimpy weak, philosophically weak ways, such that God can determine. And as a Molinist, you should have sympathy for this, which is actually, I'm going to start cracking the can on why I think Molinism is false, because it contradicts its own starting assumptions. As a Molinist, you should be very sympathetic with this, because God determines what I will freely choose to do, right? So because it's just that my inputs are present, right? So if my nature, my will, my desire, all these kind of things are of such, then I will choose something, because that's just what I am. I just am the sum total of those constituent parts, right? And on no view do we choose our constituent parts, right? Even on libertarian freedom, I don't have these I don't choose them.
Well, sure.
Right? That's why you need to seal off the will in order to maintain libertarian freedom. The compatibilists are just saying, well, you just don't need to do that, right? You don't choose your bits and your pieces, but your bits and your pieces are causally determinative of what you choose to do, because that your bits and your pieces just are what you are. That's your God-given nature. Let me give one more argument, and then I'll stop talking, because I'll show you a bunch of things. And I got this from my friend Jemmy, so I may butcher it.
Okay.
In the Bible, again, we want our philosophy to accord with our biblical theology, our biblical anthropology.
Sure.
Right. In the Bible, at the end of days, we are very clearly judged for what we are. Right. We're not just judged for the outcome of our behavior. It's not that we do sinful things and therefore we're judged. Right. The wicked are judged because they are wicked, right? If libertarian freedom is true, that's not possible. Because if libertarian freedom is true, my nature is causally indeterminate of what my actions are. So at time t1, my nature is whatever my nature is. It's causally indeterminate at what I will choose at time t2, right? This just is libertarian incompatibilism just is libertarian indeterminism, right? Because my nature cannot determine my choice, because I didn't choose my nature. If my nature has not determined my choice, that means my nature is morally neutral. Right? My nature did not causally determine me to choose a sinful thing over a non-sinful thing. My nature is equally compatible with always choosing sinful things as always choosing the right thing, because it's causally indeterminate with regards to what I actually end up choosing. So biblically, it's just not the case that our natures are causally indeterminate. Sure. Our natures are causally determinate. We are slaves to sin because we are fallen and wicked and sinful. Our natures are causally determinative of what we choose to do, right? That cannot be the case. That biblical anthropology cannot be the case if libertarian freedom is true. Because you need for the biblical anthropology to exist, you need that causal thread. You need the nature itself to be blameworthy. But on libertarianism, that cannot be the case. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I would just disagree. I mean, and of course, part of it's going to depend on what exactly you mean by causally determinate nature. Because, when you use that term causally determinate nature, does that mean the nature actually has to determine it, or it could just influence it extremely heavily?
It would have to be causally determinative, right? Okay. So because your will then would always be neutral, right? So you either
no.
Then does your will have its own nature?
No.
So your will doesn't have a nature. So your will is always neutral because there's no nature to your will.
Well, no, because
what about your will?
I have a nature and I have a will, right? Okay. And so how I use my will is going to be heavily influenced by my nature. And I don't think these two things are contradictory. So for example, when you say the nature has to be blameworthy and the choices, it's like, I see both of those perfectly in line. I mean, one thing is like, for example, let's, I don't know, pick a certain, I don't know what addiction. And let's say I smoked one cigarette one time, right? And now here, okay, I'm craving a cigarette. And well, I can choose, at least I'm going to make that assumption for the illustration. I can choose to give in, smoke the cigarette, or not give in. And this may actually be a bad example because the cigarette's more directly, tied to certain chemical neurons in your brain, as opposed to, say, choosing to watch, I don't know, porn or something like that. There are different kinds of addictions that affect the brain different ways. But so let's say I cave in to do the thing. Well, the next time I'm confronted with that choice to do it, I'm more inclined to cave in again. And it's easier also because I've trained my brain. And so once I've done that, say 2 or 3 times, my choices have corrupted the nature. And so now I'm now so inclined, now I can't choose not to smoke the cigarette, but that's because of successive choices where each time it became more necessary for me to choose it. And then
you're reifying the will as having its own nature, though. So notice you're still in a causal loop, right? In order for that to be the case, which I'm fine with, by the way. I'm fine with our choices actually corrode our nature even further. I believe in total depravity. I think sin has corrupted every single part of our nature, such that we can never do anything righteous.
Yeah. Can I real quick? I really hate to interrupt you, but just because it's like there'll be like 5 ideas talked about at a time, and then so I just want to, and they're getting more consolidated as we go, which I think is a good thing. So I do want to address the thing before I forget it, because insofar as I can appreciate and recognize what you just pointed out, that it seems I'm giving the will its own nature. And I think at this particular moment in time, I don't think I necessarily have a response to that. That really genuinely gives me pause. And I'm not afraid to admit I could be wrong about this, and I need to do some more thinking on it. Mm-hmm. But I also do think that there are similar problems insofar, because I think you said something I just disagreed with, and very respectfully. I don't think you're trying to be slippery. When you said, well, saying compatibilism is determinism, I could just say, well, compatibilism just is freedom. And it's like, well, no, because if it's free, it's not determined. And I think you made a distinction earlier that I didn't agree with, when you could say you could be determined but not forced. And again, I don't think the two work. And to where you're saying the Bible does say we are morally culpable, well, I don't see how that can be the case if we have a certain nature. And to the point, the argument you made where, okay, there's the hard determinist, which might, I don't know if you would agree that on a hard determinism, you can't be morally culpable, but that's because God in that moment causes you to choose the thing. But the problem is even on a compatibilist model, and I know you said you wouldn't defend Thomism, but I'm just thinking of Ed Feza's argument, like of the argument from Change, where at any given moment, God has to be sustaining things. Well, he's sustaining your nature. He chose to give you the nature, so maybe he determined it back then and not now. But to me, it's still determined just the same if you can choose against your nature, and he gave you that nature. And so I'm not sure that moral culpability is preserved by, say, just moving the causal chain back a bit. So maybe that's...
Yeah, so I think you just did the thing that I said. Oh, there's John. I think you did the thing that I said that you were going to do, though, which is, well, you said that you're determined and free, but that just can't be the case. And I'm going to say, well, without begging the question of the categorical ability and libertarian freedom, why?
Well, maybe this would be helpful. Can you clarify the statement you made earlier where you said you can be determined but not forced? Because I don't necessarily see a distinction between the two.
Yeah, so I can be determined to choose X, and I can freely choose to do X because I want to, right? So,
but if you can't choose your wants,
which you never choose, but this is the thing, on any view. And this is why I keep pointing out that on the libertarian view, you're hermetically sealing off the will, or you're giving it its own nature, because otherwise you're stuck saying some part of when you say I choose, you're stuck with the problem of saying I am the sum total of these things: my emotions, my intellect, my education, all of these things that you don't choose. So if you're a libertarian and you say I choose to do X, but I don't choose any of those things that make me me, you're stuck saying, then I'm not free. But that can't be the case because you affirm libertarian freedom. So then the only recourse is what you've done, which is to say, well, no, there's this kind of like qualia of myself. There's this function that's part of me, but it's not me. And it's kind of this arbitrator that can kind of choose to do things that I don't want to do. But even though I'm not the one doing it, it gets very complicated.
Well,
to avoid that very simple thing that, guess what? I choose to do something even if I don't determine what I am. So even if I don't determine what I am what I am. And not in the blasphemous sense, but I am the thing that I am. And insofar as whatever it is that's me is doing whatever it is that me wants to do, and I'm not being forced by something else to do something that whatever is me doesn't want to do, then I'm free and I'm morally responsible.
Yeah.
Right?
So
let me actually, if you can make one point, I want to say one more thing, and then I'm sure John wants to say something or have questions.
I just want to say really quickly, again, I don't necessarily, so I'm not trying to say that there's a will separate from my mind. I think part of the aspect of my mind, of me, is that will, that ability to choose. And of course there's going to be influences. But just as you're saying, well, of course I can't choose the sum total components of my nature. Mm-hmm. Let's say the nature is completely chosen by God, right? And so God, on the one hand, can make a creature with a nature that the creature doesn't choose. And that nature is such that the creature is always going to choose to do what the creature wants to do. But then he's going to make this other creature that's, again, the creature doesn't choose his nature, but part of what God chooses that nature to be is an ability to choose among a certain range of options. And to have that part of what God bestows on that is the ability to say, choose these different things. And I'm just not convinced that if God creates the former, that there is that it is forced. I don't agree that there's a meaningful distinction between determined and forced, because insofar as God creates you with a nature, and part of your nature is that you always do what the nature wants, I think that is forced and determined.
Well, so this is where I actually wanted to get to. I'm aware that we've gone for an hour and 40 minutes, and we probably want to do at least 30 minutes of Q&A or discussion. And I'm sure.
To be honest, this is both stretching me to my limits, so kind of taxing on my mind, but at the same time, one of my favorite conversations. So I really do appreciate you taking the time to do it.
Oh no, I'm third. Yeah, this is why I wanted to, I wanted to talk to you over some other people, because I've always, every time we've talked, it's been great. I've always known you to be an enjoyable person to have these conversations with. You're an eminently reasonable guy. So that's why I was like, hey, you want to have this conversation? You want to talk about it?
Now, me, on the other hand,
not so reasonable.
I don't even know how John got the password into the door. Oh,
that's true. I didn't. Oh, that's right. I sent.
Yeah.
Hey, John. So, okay. This is where I wanted to bring up Molinism, right? Because I think you have views that are not in accordance with each other. Right, because you want to affirm Molinism on the one hand. I should go. The audience is left. You want to affirm Molinism on the one hand, but then you want to affirm libertarian freedom on the other hand, because libertarian freedom is usually stated as part of the kind of mere Molinism, right? So here's the problem. Given Molinism, if Molinism is true, right? We don't have time to probably lay this all out for the entire audience of all the metaphysics. I hope enough people know what we're talking about. If not, go look up some things by Tim Stratton, and I think you've had some stuff on it and some other things.
Yeah, I've done some episodes with him.
But if Molinism is true, imagine the case where you have two worlds, right? You have W1 and W2. They are identical worlds in every possible way. They have all the exact same, down to the exact same number of palm leaves in the world, right? They are identical, except at time T1, we use John. John freely chooses to do some act X, but it's a private act, and let's say that this act has no butterfly effect. Right? Just for the sake of the argument, to avoid butterfly effect problems. So at T1, let's just say it's an act like, shaking his head or something, and there's no butterfly effect. And there's no moral difference between them. In world 1 at T1, John chooses that action. In W2 at T1, John doesn't choose that action, right? I think Molinism has two problems. Okay. It needs to say, if God chooses one of those things, the only difference between those two things, the thing that determines the outcome of that, is God determining the difference between those two worlds, because everything is causally identical going up to T1, right? There's nothing different in the world before or after T1, right? And on Molinism, God does determine the truth value of those propositions, because you need that in order to say that God chooses a world whereby he can work all things for his purposes, right? God has to be determinatively involved in that. Okay. Or the Molinist is going to say, John's choice, his by God's middle knowledge, God knew what John would choose. And so only one of those worlds, W1 or W2, is feasible for God to make.
We have different times, though.
Nope, like, same times, T1.
Okay, same times. I thought
right?
You were
same time.
Okay.
So they would have to say, because John would freely choose X, God can only actualize W1. God cannot actualize W2. Right? That's how you maintain. That's how you maintain creaturely freedom on Molinism. I think I'm not
really convinced of that.
Well, that just is Molin. I mean, that's just the two.
Well, maybe you can restate it because I missed something. So just real quick, I want to say this, and maybe we can lay this aside because maybe it's not necessary to the purposes of the illustration. But I don't think. And I could be wrong about this if I think about it more, but just initially, I don't think I would agree that it's actually logically possible to say have two different actions occurring at the same time, T1, and there not being a different butterfly effect. I'm not sure that that's actually logically possible, or even to say that the causal chain leading up to that moment can be identical if they have different things.
So at this point, I would just press on your understanding of multiple worlds. You have to be willing to grant those things. Otherwise, then I think you're just pushing back against multiple world semantics at that point.
Okay, well then that's fair, and that's not pertinent to the illustration anyway. That wouldn't be my main objection to it anyway.
But here's the problem. So you're stuck, right? So I think Molinists are stuck, I should say.
Well, repeat that last part because I think I missed something. There.
Okay, so let's actually go with, because I think it's two horns of a dilemma. So let's go with the first horn and talk about that for a second, and then we can go to the other one.
Okay.
The first horn of the dilemma is that you're stuck with that weird position that it is the case that God has determined, right? Because if the only causal difference between W1 and W2 is which one God has actualized. Right, that's the only difference between the two.
Okay, which one's God is actualized?
Up until T1, because God has so the only difference, the only thing that has determined between John choosing X and John not determining X is which world God has determined to actualize. Right, so
I agree with that.
In God determining W1, right? God has said, I'm gonna actualize W1. It means that He is determined. He has declared that all true propositions of W1 are now instantiated. God is the determining factor for all of those true propositions. He said it's going to be, let's call John's choice of X at T1 P.
Yeah.
God has now said, it is now the case. I am determining that this set of propositions is true, including P. Right, so God has now determined the truth value of all of those propositions as being true, because before he's actualized a world, all of those are hypothetical. They don't have truth values yet. They have conditional truth values, but they're not true or false yet. They're possibly true, possibly false.
Yeah.
God has now determined by actualizing W1 that they are all true.
Yes.
Right?
But I just wouldn't phrase it like that. And even if I grant that, there's still a substantial, and I do grant that, but there's still a substantial difference between that and Calvinism.
So I'm not trying to defend Calvinism right now, right? So here's the import of that, though. You now have a concept of determinism where God has determined exhaustively the truth value of every proposition in the actual world.
Mm-hmm.
And given Molinism, you have to say somehow they're free.
Yeah.
Right. So now you're a compatibilist, right? Because now you have some form of determinism is true. Some concept of freedom and moral responsibility is true.
Well, I think they would still be free if there's no desire controlling them in that proposition, because your definition is without force or coercion, and ours will be without force or coercion, or something about your nature determining that choice.
I have a response to this, but I don't want to interrupt.
Yeah. So no, that actually, so on a compatibilist view, conditional responsibility is a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition, but it's a necessary condition. On libertarian freedom, categorical ability is a necessary and sufficient condition for moral responsibility. I've just given an example where metaphysically you do not have categorical ability. P is now true. It is the case that P is true, right? God has now determined that that is the case. It cannot be not the case that P is true. Otherwise, you'd actually be stuck saying God could actualize the world intending P and P not obtain, right? So, which just is classical theism, right? At that point. Mm-hmm. So categorical ability is no longer possible.
See, I don't agree. And the reason is because this actually matters because, so for example, one might say that by God creating world X, P is necessarily going to entail, right? That's going to happen. But I wouldn't use the language, well, that means God determines P, although there is some truth to that. I just want to say that I would say God determines to create a world in which agent Y will freely choose to do P. And that really matters because
P,
as opposed to the alternative.
Remember the example. Sorry to interrupt. Remember the example. The free agent chose X. P just is the truth value of the free agent choosing X.
Oh, okay. Well, then fine. So God
P is the truth of the matter that the agent at T1 will choose X. P just is that the truth of that thing happening. Right?
Okay.
It's not the choice itself. It's the truth of the choice that we made.
Okay, well then that's fine.
Right. So now, right. So that objection doesn't work. Right. So now you have God has determined all these truth values, including the truth value, right? Because God could have chosen to actualize W2, in which case P would be false.
Well, no, the truth, because the truth value hasn't been instantiated in the world yet. You could say God has foreknowledge of the truth P, but it hasn't actually been instantiated into the world until the agent freely chooses it.
So no. So this is why, right? Because you now want to make the creation decree tensed. It's not tensed, right? So it is the case that given W1 at T1, John will choose X. That just is P. Right. So P is that conditional truth. P just is that statement of at T1, John will choose X. That's true. But that's true from the That's true from the decree to create. It's not that.
Well, look, I get it. I seriously get it. But I just want to say that it's all the difference in the world to say, okay, there's choice on God's part to create world one. Mm-hmm. And then we're both agreeing that the truth of P necessarily and logically follows from that. But the method by which it follows, to me, makes all the difference. Because if the method is, well, just from the creation of W1, there's a causal chain that unfolds and results in the person having a certain nature which they can't choose against, and then they have a certain one which that want is determined, and then they choose in line with that want, and then the choice necessarily fails. Or the other scenario is, yes, a certain link of causal chains do unfold from that, one of them being that you have creatures that have libertarian freedom, and God knows will, given their nature, given their desires, and given, say, a certain set of circumstances, will freely choose to do the thing. That doesn't refute the principle of alternative possibilities. It just, I'm agreeing that there is a decree in creation and massive influences in there.
Good. So let me say this. Let me try to clarify this one more time, because you've now jumped from one horn to the other horn. So I'm not trying to say this as a gotcha. This is
I hear you.
This is why I think this view is false, because in both sides of the coins are false. So it is the case. So you've already in order for God to have determined that P is true, I don't need to come up with the causal theory for how it comes about that it's instantiated in the real world. All I need for determinism to be true is that God has determined the truth value of that proposition. That's all that I need for determinism to be true.
Well, see, I would disagree.
What I don't need is to say that it has to have this very specific causal chain to get there.
Well, it almost seems like there's two truth values going here. Just a description, yes, I chose P, and then I freely chose X. Those seem to be two propositions. So are you saying God determines both of them?
Say your question again.
So it seems like I see two different propositions here. One, yeah, it's just a description. I chose X. We don't really get into the description of how that happened. And the other proposition would be I freely chose X. I wasn't determined to choose X. So, like, are you saying God determines both of those, or just determines the fact that I chose X?
I simply disagree with the premise of the second one, right? So notice you said, or is it the case that I'm not determined and I'm free? I just don't grant that, right? So that just is to say, okay, so is it the case that your position is true, or if I beg the question of my position, that my position is true, right? I just don't grant that as a premise, right? It's because you're smuggling in libertarian freedom through the back door, and I'm going to say, well, I just don't grant that. I don't grant that assumption, right? So, but let me go back to the horns of the dilemma, because I think that you've hit on why this is such a problem. Because now, to avoid this track of determinism, you said, okay, God has now, we agree that God has determined to create W1, right?
Yes.
And in some sense, that means he's determined that all the truth values of the propositions are now turned on, right? Think of all those switches now in the on switch, right? Those are just the true propositions that make W1 W1 and not W2 or W3 or W4, W5, whatever it is, right? W1 just is the set of those true propositions. So God, in actualizing W1, has determined which truth values will be switched on, right? But you want to say, okay, well, let's go to the other horn. Well, it's because God foreknows what John is going to choose in T1 given that context. Okay. That means that W1 and W2, not only is one of those worlds not feasible, one of those worlds is logically impossible. So you now need to demonstrate why it's the case that one of those worlds, given John's creaturely freedom, is logically impossible. But
wait, can you repeat why it's logically impossible?
Because now you're saying, well, God can't actualize the one that John doesn't. God can't actualize the one that John wouldn't choose something.
Why?
Okay, third horn. If you want to grant, I was going to push you on omnipotence, but let's say God's omnipotence means that in apologetical circles and theological circles, God's omnipotence is that God can do any logically possible thing.
Sure.
Notice
you can say logical impossibilities aren't things.
Good. So now what you have to say is, in order for a world to be not feasible, right? God's omnipotence now isn't that he can only do logically possible things. It's that he can only do logically possible things that are feasible for him to do. So there are logically possible things. It's logically possible at T1, John choose X. But now God can't actualize that because that won't be what John chooses.
It's not to, but
for some inexplicable reason. Because remember, there's not on libertarian freedom. This is a reductio argument, right? Given libertarian freedom, there's nothing about John's nature. You could rewind the tape 100 times, and it should be the case that it's 50-50 what John chooses. Again, and we're not talking about big moral cases. We're not talking about, remember, given X is just if he blinks his eyes or if he nods his head a little bit. Or it's something morally trivial, and it's something not preference driven, right? So you would have to say that there is no possible way for W2 to be instantiated. If you rewound the tape 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000 times, John would always choose X. But that it's also the case that there's nothing in John that necessitates or causally determines him to choose X, because you can't have that on libertarian freedom. So now it's inexplicable why W1 is the only world that God can actualize like that, but W2 is not, even though there's no logical impossibility to it. And there's nothing about the nature of John that causally determines him to always choose this morally insignificant, well, actually amoral, non-moral, non-significant, non-preference driven choice.
Okay, so I have a couple of things there. So the first thing, it might seem off topic, but I do think it's relevant, because what struck me is that the argument you're using against me is the same, or almost the same argument I was using to say compatibilism to me seems to reduce to determinism. Because it's like
compatibilism is determinism.
Well, right, but there was.
So you have to say what you mean.
Determinism. Well, the point is what compatibilism says is, well, free will is compatible with certain determinism, which I don't agree. I think the free will goes out the window once you have the determinism, and I think it matters because on determinism, like even certain naturalists will say, well, we still have this illusion that we're picking what we want to do, but it's determined. And so I don't think the two things are different for that reason, because it's like, well, if your nature is determined, then you have to choose what your nature wants to do. Well, you're determined to do that.
But you need to demonstrate that. You can't just beg the question of that. Remember this, again, we're going to go back to, you can't say compatibilism is false because libertarian freedom is true, or categorical ability is true, because if determinism is true, you don't have freedom.
No, I don't think. I'm saying that a freedom that isn't libertarianly free just isn't any kind of meaningful freedom.
Then you need, again, all you're saying is, if I question beg libertarianism, then libertarianism is true.
Well, no, I don't think so. I think it is an argument to say, well,
is it?
If you're, I think it's reasonable to say that if your nature is determined to be a certain way and you don't have the ability to not choose what that nature wants, then any so-called description of freedom is just meaningless.
Do you choose your nature? Did you choose your nature?
Of course not. Well,
are you free?
That's why I gave the example earlier, smoking. In part, I choose it. Like I can choose things that affect my nature and that are going to affect the.
But what do you mean by you? Who is the you that's choosing? What is the constitutive part of you that's doing the choosing?
It's me. I have that ability.
When you say me, when you point to the self, do you mean your mind, your intellect, your emotions, your history, your nature, your nurture? What do you mean by me when you say that? Flesh it out. When you say I choose, when you say I, what is that's the signifier? What's the concept behind the I that makes the choice?
This might start getting into dualism, and I have been slightly changed my mind on I still endorse dualism, but I've changed. I used to use the analogy.
Dualist, right?
I used to use the analogy that the brain's the tool that the mind uses to interact in the world. I would now kind of relent on that, because I wouldn't say, well, the mind is just this independent entity that just uses the body like a puppet. I would say that, yes, my nature is part of what makes me up. So I'd say I have an immaterial aspect to me, a mind, and a material aspect to me, that being the physical body. So, yeah, and I would say part of the what would you say? The capacity of that immaterial aspect of me is the ability to make choices. But real quick, because I think this matters, because insofar as
before you move on, sorry to interrupt. I want an answer to that question before you move. My son's going to come in the camera, by the way. Okay. Before you move on, because you keep begging the question. So I want to find out what you mean when you say I choose, right? Because you're relying on that to move your argument forward. And I'm going to say, what do you mean? You know, shout out to John McRae. What do you mean? What do you mean when you say I choose? I is the signifier.
Yeah.
What's the concept? Because you want to say if I don't determine if I don't determine what makes up I, then I don't freely choose. So I'm going to say, okay, on your view, when you say I choose as the source, what do you mean is the I? And I think you realize very quickly the problem is whatever concept you want to put in that, you didn't determine it. You didn't choose it. So you're stuck with this problem. And again, this is why you have to go back to make your will its own entity almost. Because the instant you ground it in the I, you're back to a nature that you didn't determine, yourself, which you didn't determine making the choices.
Well, sure, but here's the thing is, I didn't determine that I would have the ability to choose between options. That's correct. I didn't determine that I would have that nature.
Okay, but you're saying compatibilism has to be false because if determinism is true and I didn't determine my nature, whatever is determined can't be free. Okay, and I'm going to say, well, if you want to say libertarian freedom is grounded in sourcehood, right? You can't question beg libertarianism. And when you try to ground it in sourcehood, if that source isn't something that the self has chosen anyways, then even on your own critique, it's not free. So what you're saying is compatibilism is false for a condition that also exists in my own view, which would mean my own view is false.
So I don't think so.
Okay, so then back to what is it about you that when you say I choose, just list off the things. When you say I chose, I is the signifier. What is the concrete concept under it?
What do you mean? What is the concrete?
So when I say I chose ice cream, I mean everything that is constituent of myself. I mean my mind, my person, my taste, my nature, my body, my physicality, everything that Bignon and others call my God-given nature. It's this cluster of things.
I will take that and I will use the same definition, but I'll just add one thing. I'll say, yes, my taste, my things, and also my ability to pick between this and this.
Okay.
And now by the way, I want to argue because I'm not assuming my view in here, because I think you said earlier that, of course, our biblical theology has to inform our beliefs on this. Mm-hmm. And so insofar as, it's like, okay, let's say I think I have libertarian free will, and maybe there's an aspect of me begging the question there and just assuming I have this libertarian freedom. Now, insofar as my thinking goes, and I know you don't agree, insofar as my thinking goes, this is a coherent concept that preserves, say, an ability to make choices. Now, if we take freedom and say, okay, it's not libertarian freedom, it's freedom that's more in the context of a compatibilism. Mm-hmm. Well, my argument is, well, that's no meaningful kind of freedom, because it's ultimately down to this nature that I didn't choose, these wants I didn't choose, and then this capacity that I didn't choose to have to choose what my nature entails me to. And so insofar as I would say, well, I have a biblical theology that clearly says, I made in the Imago Dei, it talks about, there's many, I could pull up the verses if you want me to, but they're talking about free choice and urging you to choose life over death and urging people to turn from the ways of free choices and holding them morally accountable. Right. I would say that biblical view of theology I have, I don't think is compatible with this view, even though it uses the term freedom and moral responsibility. I don't think those things actually fit in with this kind of more hard determinism, even though I know you don't think it's hard determinism. I do, because I don't see the difference. versus
because you're begging the question of libertarian. Again, you just keep saying it. And I mean, again, I mean this as nice as I can. But you keep going back to that. That can't be true because libertarianism just has to be true.
So okay, I'm going to
if I assume determinism, if I assume that sourcehood is necessary for freedom, right, which you haven't demonstrated, right? Well, then it has to be the case that compatibilism is false. Well, why is compatibilism false? Because sourcehood has to be true. That's a circular way to go. And let me go back to the biblical example, right? So that I simply don't think it's the case that the Bible shows libertarian. It's just flat out false that it shows libertarianism. All that it shows is that when we have sufficient choice to make, we are morally responsible. Well, the compatibilist says nothing on compatibilism denies that. On compatibilism, I choose to do X, and I'm morally responsible when I choose to do X, and I choose in response to imperatives. There's nothing about that. This is actually why in something like Genesis 50, where Joseph is talking to his brothers, he says, "You intended it for good, but God intended it for evil." The brothers and God have the same verb relating to the same action, right? They both have the same intent for this exact identical action, right? But the brothers intended something that was their choice. They intended it for evil. God himself intended it. Again, they related to the action in the same way, but with different intents, right? So it's simply, and yet the brothers are morally responsible, and yet God intended it, right? So
that just is Molinism. Is yes, God takes into account their free choices to. Well, it doesn't have to be Molinism, but I would say
that's why I said the Bible just is theory neutral on these. What the Bible shows us, and this is why I'm a compatibilist. What the Bible shows us is we have choices to make, and we're morally responsible, and God determines.
See, I think
that's all that it doesn't give a theory of how that metaphysically happens.
No, so and I don't mean this in any kind of negative sounding way. I think compatibilism taken to its extreme would be Molinism. And the reason is because, and this might be where we're missing each other here, because I think you were actually correct earlier when you said I was begging the question by assuming libertarian freedom. Although I think the reason that that's unfolding the way it is because I think what I am assuming is freedom. That I'm just at a bare minimum, yes, I'm presupposing freedom because to me that's such an undeniable reality, just like moral values are an undeniable reality. The external world, it's just like I just start with that reality around me. I start with the reality of freedom. Now, I think in order to justify that freedom that I start with and rationally understand it, that to me, that's why I have to put it in that libertarian context. And if I go to this compatibilistic context and say, okay, well, I have to understand what I'm bringing to the table of freedom in this context, well, I don't think that's any kind of freedom at all. So just to kind of call it freedom, to call it compatibilism,
right?
I just don't think works. I just don't think that's any kind of freedom
But that's just to beg the question, right? So all you've done, let me put this in apologetics context. All you've done is say, well, faith just is blind faith without evidence. You can call your intellectual things faith all you want, but that's just not what faith is. That's something else. That's all you've done with freedom. All you've done is say, well, if I define freedom as libertarian freedom, then whatever you say over here, that's just not what freedom is.
Well, not necessarily, because I think to an extent you and I would agree that, okay, would we agree? Let's just say on this, that genuine freedom, let's just say genuine freedom entails moral responsibility.
Well, no, because I can have free choices of things that aren't moral. I would put it the other way. I'd say moral responsibility entails genuine freedom. You have the
you may have said backwards, but yes, even if we say not morally, we could just say I'm responsible for the choices I make, something like that. Would that be an okay way to say it?
I'm not sure that I have responsibility in non-moral case. I might be the causal agent of something, but I don't have responsibility.
Let's go to the part we agreed on where moral responsibility entails genuine.
Yeah.
What does it mean to be a causal agent on compatibilism?
It means that I am. So remember,
you're using this language of I am, which I get you mean a different thing than libertarians, but
yeah. So on determinism, on compatibilism, sourcehood isn't false. It's just incomplete, right? I still am the causal agent for my action. In fact, I would say that this is where I push and I say compatibilism actually is, I think, the only thing that upholds moral responsibility, because it means that I am, my nature, everything apart myself actually is morally responsible for the outcomes that come from my choices, because I am causing them. See, right? This is where I was pushing Stillman earlier, is to say, okay, but on libertarianism, nothing about my nature determines my choices. So nothing about my nature is causally determinative. With
each choice, though, it's not the whole collection. It's one certain thing, whether an emotional or physical thing, determining that choice. So I still get really confused with this language of I am on compatibilism.
Well, compatibilism, I am, it just is the sum total of all your things. Compatibilism doesn't break it down into constituent parts.
Yeah, but your choices are determined by constituent parts. Is that not compatibilism?
No, no. On compatibilism, your choices are, you have the conditional ability to do what you want. Every part of your nature goes into and informs what you want, right? So I might have I don't like ketchup. I have a physical repulsion against ketchup. I could have emotional reasons to not like it. I could have bad childhood memories from why I don't want to eat it. I could have, there could be sociological reasons why I might not want to eat it on, maybe it's at a steakhouse and I don't want to eat it also because eating ketchup on steak is a major social faux pas. And there's all these kinds of, all of that stuff. Right? I could have, my mind is engaged in the reasoning of, well, I know that every single time I've had ketchup in the past, I've had a revulsion to it. And so therefore in the future, I could have that kind of deductive movement of my reason. Every part of my constituent part informs that desire, right? So when we say I desire on compatibilism, it's I am the sum total of my parts, right? Okay. So
can I make a couple arguments here? Just, sure. I have 3 points I want to. Well, I'll leave the one aside because that'll be going back to the possible world thing, and we don't necessarily have to go back there. So what I was getting at earlier with, if we agree that, say, I'm at a loss for the right words here, but say moral responsibility entails genuine freedom. So, and then when you said, okay, well, if I say the freedom that to me exists within compatibilism is no kind of freedom at all, if that for me begs libertarian freedom, or begs the question for that because it assumes it, well, I would say insofar as we both agree that moral responsibility seems to be a part of this, and we both agree that that's real, and I say, well, I look at the compatibilist model and I'm not convinced that there would be moral responsibility in that model, then I would say that, well, that is at least some justification for me to say, well, then there does seem to be something wrong with this kind of freedom if I don't see moral responsibility in it, and so I'm going to look for my kind of freedom elsewhere.
So would you ever allow? Again, let's go back. So now you've said, now you've said I have sufficient reason to question beg libertarian freedom if I have incredulity to another view.
Well, no. I'm not, because I'm not.
Do we ever allow incredulity as warrant in question begging for the atheist?
Well, no, but I don't think that's what I did.
Well, when you say I don't know what the self is on libertarianism, what is the perspective you're coming from there? It's not, honestly, I won't accuse you of incredulity. Is it just reading it and you just honestly don't get or understand it? Is there something in my mind that makes more sense that may not be in your mind?
Right. So this is why, and I've asked probably a dozen times, and again, I love stuff. I'm going to continue to watch the show. I don't think I've gotten an answer because I think you realize the corner that puts you in. On libertarianism, it's not simple incredulity, right? I've actually given arguments without begging the question of my own definitions for why it is the case that on libertarianism, this creates a problem. Because if it's any part of your nature that is the self-choosing, and you don't choose that part of your nature, then whatever criticism you want to give of compatibilism is reflexive against your own view. You've undermined your own view. but that can't be the case. And so we never get an answer of what it is about the, you start getting these abstractions about the self where the self isn't actually the self. It is no part of who you are. And then you say, okay, well, it's the soul. Okay, did you choose the soul or did God give you the soul?
Well, right. That's why I didn't.
It never becomes a thing that you have chosen for yourself. But then you have to abandon in principle. But then you have to abandon in principle the objection that if I don't choose my own nature that does the choosing, I'm not free. Because now that's part of your own view, right? So I'm going to say I don't have mere incredulity against the libertarian view. I now have a positive argument that their view succumbs, if true, to their own principled objection, if true.
Okay, well, so I want to make 2 points there, and the first point is, to me, I'm not saying, excuse me, I don't think I'm committing to this personal incredulity principle where I'm saying, well, on compatibilism, I just don't see any way you can have moral accountability, so I'm going to go with my view. Just like, for example, when we make the moral argument, we're not just saying, well, on atheism, I don't see any way you could have objective morality there. Right? In my view, it's a positive argument that atheism is incompatible with, say, an objective moral values and duties. And I do think that there's a positive case that compatibilism, at least the way you've defined it in this episode, would be incompatible with genuine moral responsibility.
Okay.
And then
why? So before we move on, why? Without saying, well, freedom just is categorical ability. Freedom just is the ability to choose contrary. Without begging the question and defining without kind of definitional fiat, right? Can you state in a simple sentence what is right? Because when I'm talking to an atheist, I can show I can give principled reasons why naturalism cannot account for objective morality, because naturalism is itself amoral. It has no indifference to morality. It has no objective authority. It has no bearing on persons. It has no intention. I can give a whole host of reasons why naturalism cannot account for objective morality. I don't engage in definitional fiat. Right. So my question is, okay, so you've said I now have these positive reasons why determinism cannot ground genuine freedom. Okay, do that without definitional fiat of saying, well, being free just is libertarian.
Right. So I would say genuine moral responsibility. For example, we put somebody on court for killing someone, or not on court, on trial for killing someone. The idea of the moral responsibility is you were wrong. You ought not have killed that person. You ought have chosen not to kill them, even if you were extremely angry at them. But on compatibilism, because they could not have not wanted to. They could not have chosen to not kill the person because they could not have contradicted their desires, and they could not have desired to not kill the person. So it's discernment, and I don't see that's actual moral responsibility in that case.
So it's not the case. So okay, conditional ability isn't. You're thinking of it in causative terms, right? Conditional ability is not that they couldn't have not wanted it. Right? It's not a negative principle, right? It's simply, I'm morally responsible if I wanted to do X and I did X, right? You're looking to turn it into a negative principle. It's not a negative principle. It's a positive principle of ability, right? So, okay. And let me, we've now been 2 hours and 20 minutes, and my children are starting to wake up. So I'm sure there are some audience members. Let me go one more theological implication of this, right? So given Molinism, given libertarian freedom, right? Let's just run a reductio. Let's say libertarian freedom is true, right?
Okay.
God actualizes W1, right?
W1, right.
God foreknows prior to creation that at T1 I would choose X.
Okay.
Right? Okay. Let me ask you one question going in. This is somewhat of it's not a trap question, but kind of. a basic orthodoxy question. Omniscience, it is impossible for God to fail to know something true. It's not even possible for God to fail to know something true, right? Okay. God has now actualized W1. He knew prior to creating W1 that at T1 I would choose X. At T1, is it a real metaphysical possibility for me to choose to do not X?
Define metaphysical possibility.
Do I have the real ability, right? I can will to flap like a bird, but can I? Do I have the free will ability to choose not X?
Well,
is it true that I could possibly choose not X?
Well, because the way you just said it, you said, well, can I will to flap like a bird? Well, no, because here's the thing, you can will to flap like a bird, you just can't physically do it. So that's a different question than, well, could I will to do something else that I could actually do? I'm going to say you have that capability, but God didn't actualize the world in which you would choose to do that.
Okay. You've now hit both horns, right? So now because now we're talking, I'm not talking about choice, right? We've said categorical ability is the ability to choose to do other than you choose, right? You've now said, well, no, I can't choose other than I choose because God has determined in this world what I will choose, right?
Well, you wouldn't.
Okay.
Like the thing is like,
I'm not asking, I'm saying, is it possible? Is it even possible? Do I really
it's
have
not possible that it will happen?
Not X.
It's not possible that it will happen.
So it's impossible for me to actually choose not X.
Let me make this distinction because this might help. Because the way, at least I as a monist often say this, is God created the set of, by God, say, decreeing the set of circumstances and placing you in the circumstances, knowing what you would freely choose to do given those set of circumstances, he's able to, decree human history in that sense and have complete control over it in that sense.
You're stuck because you're trying to drop someone with libertarian free. You're trying to have your cake and eat it too. If you drop someone into circumstance X, if you drop someone into that situation, right? What you're saying is God knows what they will choose to do, right?
What they will freely choose to do.
What they'll freely choose to do, right? But you want to assume libertarian freedom. So I'm going to ask you, when he drops them in that context, they have libertarian freedom. In context C, God foreknows that they would choose X. Do they actually have now the freedom to do not X? You have to say yes if you're a libertarian freedom, because that just is what you've been question begging that they have. Otherwise, you're saying they can't.
Is there to me, and again, I'm not saying this as a pejorative. I do think there's one of these issues, and I don't think you're doing it on purpose, where the definitions are kind of changing within the argument, because it's like, do I have the ability to choose
categorical ability? I'm consistently using categorical ability in this thought experiment because it's a reductio. Right? This is a reductio ad absurdum. I'm saying I'm assuming your starting conditions.
Yes.
So I'm assuming categorical. When I say ability, I mean categorical ability. And I mean the same thing in every time I use it. On Molinism, God has context C. He drops someone with categorical ability into that situation. Categorical ability is the ability to do other than what they choose. Does that person have, in God's creation, with God being omniscient, does that person have the categorical ability in that context to choose other than what God foreknows they would choose?
So some Molinists might get mad at me for this, and I might have to do some. People don't take me at my word here. I'm going to say no, and the reason I'm going to say no is because, but see, to me, and the reason I'm going to say no, part of what's built into my answer here is why I think libertarian freedom is preserved is it's precisely because God knows they have this ability to choose different things that he created circumstances C as opposed to circumstances B, because he wanted them to choose X as opposed to Y. And he knows in circumstances B, they would have chosen Y, but in circumstances C, they're going to choose this. But I just do think it's a relevant difference that they're freely choosing X in circumstance C. And yes, I do think there is determinism in the sense that God determined to create the universe in which they would freely choose to do this. But so I don't know. Again, Mullins might get mad at me for that answer, but I think given the circumstances,
you've just affirmed about 3 contradictions is why. So again, I agree. God is determined. Yes, God is determined. I agree. You don't have categorical ability, and yet this is the whole point of this reductio. You just affirmed you don't have categorical ability. You cannot choose to do other than what you choose given that context, which you didn't choose. But you still say you're morally sufficient and that you freely chose. But you've just said everything you've said was required to deny compatibilism. You have to be able to choose you have to be the source. You have to be able to choose your outcome. You have to be able to choose contrary. You have to have the ability to choose contrary in order to have moral sufficiency. You've just conceded you don't have any of those things on Molinism in that context.
Okay, so I think I made a mistake there. I wouldn't say you don't have the ability, but I would just say
you do have the categorical ability, given that context, to choose other than what God foreknew you would choose.
See, that's where I don't like it. That's where it's getting wrong.
I know you don't like it, but
no, because I do.
But that's a logical contrapositive. Whatever, and I'm phrasing it this way for a reason, because I don't want to have to hash out 13 premises, right? I can shortcut it, right? God
because
foreknows what it is that you would choose, right? So the reason why I say it this way is because what it is that you would choose and what God foreknows you choose are identical things, right? So I can say, okay, now can you do other than what you would choose in that context? And you're going to want to say yes. And I'm going to say, okay, well, God foreknows what you would choose.
Yeah, right? So I don't say they're identical things.
Doing a shortcut.
I think you can say the truth value is identical, but they're not. What I choose is not identical to God's knowledge, because God's knowledge isn't causative.
I didn't say it's causative. So here's again.
So but I want to just say I can affirm that I could have the ability to choose otherwise, but what I don't have the ability to do is to fool God or do something he didn't expect.
Okay. So what you're saying is I have the ability to choose other than what I chose, but I can't possibly choose what I didn't actually choose. So I'm able to choose other than I got choose.
No, I just want to whatever happened. And that's what I meant earlier when I said Mullins might get mad at me, and I said no, you can't. I would say I'm saying can't in the sense of I wouldn't. God created a universe in which I wouldn't make that choice. So if you want to call that can't, then fine.
So God has determined your nature within that context, which you didn't choose. So you wouldn't choose something other than what he wanted you to choose.
But he didn't determine the kind of nature that I had. No, because he didn't determine the nature. Well, then if I'm a compatibilist, you're saying there's a problem with this view. I think the problem would have to mirror incompatibilism. But I'm not saying that God determined circumstances, then determined my nature, and that nature would be such that I would want a specific thing and I would have to do what I wanted and then place me in that. I'm rather saying God creates me, I have a certain nature, and part of that nature is the ability to make choices. And God wants me to make, say, choice X as opposed to Y. I have the ability to choose both, but God knows if he placed me in circumstance C, I'll choose X. So he places me in circumstance C, then that's fine. My choice is still free, and God still determined it, and I still have the ability, but I just will never choose to do Y. I'll choose to do X because of the circumstance he placed me in.
But you've just undermined every objection you give to compatibilism. So context is down here. God makes you up here. Again, the problem with Molinism, I mean, I've said this many times, is Molinism ends up in compatibilism, ends up just as determined as compatibilistic. It just has a mountain of unnecessary metaphysics to get there, and I think actually creates problems for omniscience and aseity and immutability. But that's
wouldn't we at least agree that the person is significantly different in both? Because one person is saying that
they're not significant.
The Molinist is saying this person has this capacity to choose, and the Calvinist isn't.
No. Okay. You have context down here. God creates you up here, right?
Yes.
Did you choose your nature up here?
No.
Okay. You didn't choose your nature. You didn't choose anything about the self.
It depends. Did I choose my nature from birth? Of course not. But do I have multiple opportunities?
We're talking pre-creation, right? This all happens prior to creation. It happens in logical moments, not temporal moments.
Right, but there's an important distinction here, which is when God is prior to the decree of creation, when God is choosing to create world one in which I'll have a given nature, part of what he has to take into account is what I'll freely choose to do with that nature. And so you have to, on the one hand, you can say, here's the thing, I do think that we actually do in part have choices with certain aspects of our nature. Again, if I choose to smoke the cigarette instead of not, that's going to change my ability in the future to resist the cigarette. So that's going to affect my nature in that way. Now, I understand, I take seriously your point where you're saying, well, rewind the clock. God knew you would make that choice that would affect your nature. So in a sense, even that part of the nature was determined prior to creation. My whole point is that what God had to take into account in that prior decree of creation is what I would freely choose to do and how that would affect the nature.
So there's a couple. Again, I'm trying to press you to consistency, right?
Fair enough.
There's a couple of problems with it. First of all, and this is a new argument that I'm just now making, you just denied aseity, because now God is doing things. His response. He is doing things in response to his creation, which he has not yet created, right? Which is God is no longer ase. Besides,
I disagree. Keep going.
So let's just say we can deny aseity and it's fine, right?
No, I wouldn't deny aseity. That's not fine.
So is God's knowledge now conditioned upon everything in himself, or is it now conditioned upon something outside of himself?
Well, is God's knowledge a part of himself?
Yes,
yeah.
God is conditioned by nature.
Part of his knowledge is what creatures would freely do if he created creatures. Wouldn't that even apply to Calvinism, though?
No, it doesn't. This is so. And this is one of the reasons why Calvinists push, one of the many reasons we push back on monism and Arminianism, actually, because it violates aseity, because it means so John, to your question, omniscience is part of God's perfection. So God has his knowledge as his nature, right? So God doesn't have his knowledge as conditioned upon something else. God is by nature omniscient because God is perfect. So he's perfect in knowledge. If his knowledge is conditioned on his future creation, that means something about him by nature is conditioned on something outside of himself. Aseity just is that nothing about God is conditioned on anything outside of God. Right?
Okay.
So this already violates aseity. But again, aseity is I think necessarily true as an aspect of God's perfection,
yes,
but like simplicity, there are theologians who deny it. So,
because you said you would press me to consistency, I'm going to press you to consistency here. Does God know prior to his decree of creation, on a Calvinist view, does God know prior to his creation what he's going to determine to be the case in the creation?
Yes. So this is the difference on Calvinism. Well, really, this isn't even a Calvinist thing. This is actually just a classic. You have to remember, Molinism is a new trajectory that started, right? On classical theism, God has two moments of knowledge. He has natural knowledge and free knowledge, right? None of his knowledge is conditioned upon his knowledge of middle knowledge doesn't exist. Remember? So on classical theism, and so nothing about his knowledge is conditioned upon future agency. What it is God knows his nature, and he knows if I decree X, then X will be true. So all God's free knowledge is rooted in God's natural knowledge, right? Because he knows if I decree X, then X will be true. And he knows in virtue of I will create X. Hey, buddy. Therefore, since I did not create not X, then not X is true. Or had I created not X, then not X would be true. His knowledge, all of his knowledge, is rooted in his own decrees and his own nature. So nothing about God's knowledge is conditioned on anything about himself outside of himself. In classical theism, no part of God's knowledge is conditional upon his creation. On middle knowledge, his middle knowledge is entirely conditioned. So the truth value of what John would choose at X1 is conditioned. God knowing that is conditioned on what John will do.
So I actually think I can have my cake and eat it too here, because just that's Tyler's YouTube channel. Everybody go subscribe. I think I can have my cake and eat it too, because I would say, for example, God, on my view, God could determine to create a universe that would be what the Calvinist describes as the world and decree everything. And God could also, this is completely, and this world is dependent on his knowledge, he could choose to also create free creatures. It's just he knows if I'm going to create free creatures and I'm not going to force them to choose X, well, then what circumstances would I have to place them in to choose X?
Okay. But in that context, God, on classical theism, God knows if I create this person in X, then they would choose, right? The subjunctive is still rooted in God's natural knowledge that whatever he decree comes to pass, right? So it's still rooted in God. Middle knowledge is not rooted in God's knowledge, right? In God's decree. It's not rooted in God's natural knowledge. It is the truth value of propositions in middle knowledge are true in virtue. The truth makers of them have nothing to do with God. His knowledge is conditioned upon his creation.
So I'm just going to have to plead ignorance here on this. I'm going to plead ignorance on these distinctions between natural knowledge and free knowledge. So I'm just going to give you the floor here.
That's fine. But and again, I keep trying to go to the audience because we've been going for 2.5 hours. Maybe we should. Maybe
this has been. I have to thank you. This has been such a rich conversation, and it's
been fantastic.
Got me to think a lot.
I am. I mean, I thoroughly enjoy, and I hope that no one thinking that I get emphatic is me getting. I'm not even. I'm not frustrated.
I hope people don't think that about me too.
Conversations when it comes to this, so you're being pretty kind. So
I haven't. I just to let you know, because there may seem times when I've seemed angry. I have an unfortunate tendency to, like, I get frustrated with myself because I get frustrated. Oh, I'm not communicating this right, or there's this idea and I feel like I should have said it, and then that comes out like I'm yelling at you. You know what I mean? But that's not what I mean.
You're fine. I often say, if you're going to debate passionately, but it doesn't mean that
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I'm passionate too. So.
So I think, and then I really do want to. Wrap up and go to some other people. Yeah. I still want to go back and say that given your Molinism, so if you have the context down here and God creates you up here, you don't choose, and God is saying, I'm going to put you in this context so that you would choose X, right? He's determining that you're going to choose X because he's determining every feature of that, including your nature, which responds to and chooses within that context X, right? So again, I'm not saying therefore compatibilism is true, right? I'm saying that therefore what you can't do is those sourcehood objections of saying, well, I can demonstrate libertarian freedom and say that the only type of freedom that's real freedom is if I can determine everything that causes my decision, including whatever part of me that since I don't determine the parts of me that causally determine my choices, I'm not free. I'm going to say, given Molinism, those same conditions exist. So if you want that to be an objection against compatibilism, that scalpel just is reflexive against your own view. So either you need to abandon that as a principled objection, or you need to abandon or heavily modify your Molinism. That's really
and two other Molinists. Like if I've said something horrifically incorrect, listen, I'm a layman when it comes to this. Like, so I've just been enjoying the complexity of the discussion and whatnot. I easily could have said something terribly incorrect to Molinism. I would just say to that, to me, it just like I think I agree with you absolutely that God decrees human history from the decree of creation, that he decrees the outcome he wants. To me, it just makes all the difference if his active decree takes into account freedom or just giving them a nature that's going to determine what they choose.
Right.
To me, that's just a very relevant difference that I'm happy to hang my hat on. But people sending questions because I don't necessarily. But let me give you the last word because you're the guest. So if you want to tell me that that's theoretical, I'm okay with it.
No, yeah, I mean, I think that I've said most of the things that I would want to say. If anyone wants to go further in this, I mean, if you look up the Freed Thinker podcast, and within there I have a collection on Reformed theology, which I talk about some of these things. And I have a collection on Molinism where I give a whole bunch of. I have 21 different blog posts or episodes, kind of mixed debates, whatever it is, on these issues dealing with Molinism. I would just go back and say that I think what we very clearly see is that God is creator, God is sovereign, God determines whatsoever comes to pass by the sovereignty of his will. But that we still choose to do the things that we want to do, that I still choose exactly the things that I want to do. And I'm still morally responsible for those things. So even though, for example, I am a slave to, in my flesh, I'm a slave to sin. In Christ, I'm free from sin. Even though my nature is determinative of those things, I can't stand before the judge and say, the sinner can't stand before the judge who's a slave to sin and say, since I couldn't not sin, therefore I shouldn't be morally responsible.
Yeah.
That it's very, very clear that even though God has determined all things, and even though we are slaves and bound by our nature, we are still morally responsible. And the beautiful thing about that is that we are now slaves in Christ, that we have his foreign righteousness imputed to us. And so that even though that's the case, we still have the beauty of the gospel, that we have salvation from those things because Christ chose the ultimate desire, which is the desire to please God. So I think really the takeaway from that, no matter what perspective you have, the takeaway should still be to give glory to God for all things. So.
Yeah, agreed. And so that's a great closing to say, amongst all our differences, we can plead everyone, turn your heart to Jesus. He promises to give you a new heart and new wants and new desires to live for him. And that's a beautiful thing. I put this up because I'm not sure exactly what it's saying. I thought you might, and so you might want to respond to it.
So categorical ability is unnecessary. Source incompatibilism is fine. Source incompatibilism just entails categorical ability. It entails that I have the ability to choose other than what I choose, including to choose things as my own agent, right? So categorical ability and source incompatibilism just they're not contradictory, and it seems to me that source incompatibilism just entails categorical ability, even though categorical ability doesn't entail source incompatibility. You could be a different type of incompatibilist, but I think all versions of incompatibilism affirm some kind of categorical ability.
I saw 2 comments earlier roasting Tyler.
Probably.
You may have already answered this during the stream, but they just added this.
Yeah, so this is where.
Were they the same one that just put on the one that you just read?
What's that?
Yeah,
they're the same ones. Okay, so they're asking for clarification. Okay, fair enough. So you may have already answered a bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, my stance on source incompatibilism is just that it reflexively destroys itself, because it says you're not sufficiently free, or source incompatibilism is that you're sufficiently free because as the source, if you're the causal agent, then you're free. Okay. The thing that makes it source incompatibilism, because again, I've already said a compatibilist can believe you could be a source compatibilist, right? So I can say, I'm morally responsible because I choose to do what I want to do. I am the source of my choice, right? But the source incompatibilist is going to come along and say, yeah, but on compatibilism, you didn't choose your own nature, right? Or you didn't choose, you're not able to choose other than what you choose. So for source incompatibilism to have any teeth to it, it either needs to push on categorical ability, which this person says is irrelevant anyway. So then they would have to push on that ontological question of, well, you didn't choose your own nature. But then that's when I push back and say, okay, well, Mr. Source Incompatibilist, when you say you are the source, what do you mean by you? If you don't mean any aspect of your nature that you didn't choose. So that's kind of my take on it, is that source incompatibilism either is reflexively destructive or else it just has no teeth.
What does this mean? This has got Jefferson Yakitori. Jefferson Yakitori is quite the idiot. I think all three of us can agree with that.
I hear he completely demolished me the other day in a discussion though. So yeah, I was in sackcloth and ash, and just in a dark room crying, asking my children to not look me in the eyes for like 2 days.
Well, he also commented, "I'm surprised Tyler is still doing these conversations. Common sense would say to give up after Matt Dillahunty owned him, but he's a slavery apologist anyway, so that's okay."
There was a question right here, and now I'm upset that I can't find it. Oh, well, this is kind of off topic, but yes, we are planning to do a debate review sometime next week. I'm egging to get Braxton Hunter on for it, so people message Braxton Hunter, go comment on LSU and tell him to come on for that.
Is that a
Braxton Hunter for this conversation?
It's a mythicist debate.
I didn't get a chance to see it yet. I'm gonna have to watch it. The question was, shouldn't the Romans have refuted the resurrection? Was the debate question. So now where they went on that, my guess is, your guess is as good as mine. Somebody's speaking another language in this.
Guessed.
Try not to have dead air. No. Well, here you go. Tyler, how are you feeling about your upcoming debate on Romans 9? Yeah, you mentioned that at the beginning of the show.
Yeah, I mean, I feel pretty good. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. John Cranman and I, we're going to have a conversation about, it started off kind of general and vague, and we realized there was too much ground to cover. It was going to be just what's the best understanding of Romans 9. And so it's kind of switched to what's the best understanding of the concept of election in Romans 9. And so we're going to have that conversation. I mean, I'm obviously a Calvinist, so I think that unconditional election is the best understanding. He affirms a corporate view of election. So he affirms, he's not a provisionist, but he affirms the provisionist or the quasi-provisionist understanding of election, because historic Arminianism doesn't affirm corporate election either. I mean, historic Arminianism is semi-Augustinian. It affirms individual election. It just affirms it, under the auspices of the preconditions of prevenient grace first. So he's going to be interesting to have a conversation with, because he's not a provisionist, but he really takes largely a provisionist understanding that kind of comes out of that tradition, and they largely got it from Karl Barth, and so it's going to be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, I do want to endorse this book, and I have to admit it kind of hurt me in the soul earlier when you made the comment, because God Over All, Divine Aseity, and the Challenge of Platonism was one of my favorite books. So I'm very big on the topic of divine aseity. I'll definitely do some thinking about that. But I have to say, per this comment, I think, gentlemen, we have been thoroughly debunked per this comment.
Oh man, yeah.
Max Great Muffin.
Well, that came up. I forget who. Yeah, what's the book that I talked to? The Maximally Great Blueberry Muffin or something like that.
Jefferson Yakitori.
Yeah.
Well, he used a muffin with 3 berries that
three berries
into nature.
Here's a good question. If you think Christianity is true and not Islam, then why on Amazon does Quran have the author as Allah?
Because we only kind of write or read, so obviously God wrote for him.
Is that true? I'm gonna fact check this. Because if that's true, man, well, actually, I should, you know what? I'm not monetized anyway, so I can freely say this. Amazon is highly politically correct. If anybody hasn't been able to tell in recent times.
This actually raises what I think is an interesting defense of compatibilism, though, that a lot of people have give. I give a version of it in my blog, though, which is that inspiration actually is a compatibilistic endeavor, that God has determined his word, and Paul freely chose to write Romans. And so that also, we don't have to delve into that here. Obviously, we're trying to wrap up, but I think that God being the author of his own word and intending and directly determining, and by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit directly causing, his own word. As Protestants, we would affirm verbal plenary inspiration, which is that each word is inspired by the Holy Spirit. But we would also affirm the free authorship of Paul over his work. So that's an argument that I've given many times in favor of compatibilism, where determinism and free choice are equally operative.
Yeah, I actually have a question for you, because this is something that I think about, and it is weird how it just occurred to me one day, because obviously we have arguments like the ontological argument or the transcendental argument, and there are always arguments that eventually what we get to is a necessary being. And so, for example, it's necessary that God be omnipotent. It's necessary he be omniscient. It's impossible that he be limited in knowledge. It's impossible that he be limited in power. And so one thought that popped into my head, and you can tell me if you even agree with the premise of the argument, but then I'm curious as to your answer. To me, that would also entail it's impossible that he be 4 in person or 2 in person. And so if it's necessary, it seems that it's necessary that he's 3 in person. And then so it's just out of sheer curiosity, what is it about 3 that's necessary and not 4, not 2?
Yeah, I have no idea. I've actually, I've asked the same thing. So I think that this is where I somewhat am a little divergent from my own presuppositional kin, is that I think that the best we can get in a philosophically robust sense is that we can get that God is multi-personal, because I think that God is the transcendental necessity for. I think God solves and grounds the problem of the one and the many, where things can have oneness and multiplicity, because God is at the same time one and many.
So does the invisible muffin, though.
Well, the invisible muffin had one. It modally had 3 blueberries. So, you can stop talking, you heretic. So, so I think the multi-personality of God is demonstrable. There's a book written recently by I think it's Bosserman, where he actually makes an argument for the Trinity, the 3 persons of the Trinity, being actually the necessary, and he actually deals with this 3-ness of it. So you may want to check it out. It's if you look up Bosserman on Amazon, it has something to do with Reflections on the Trinity or something like that. I haven't read it. I've heard it's very good, but it's not my topic of research right now, so I haven't read it myself. But the people who have endorsed it to me are people I would trust their recommendations. So for whatever that's worth.
What? I don't even know. Is that a thing? Solely flesh?
Yeah. So he's I am not a dualist. No,
just kidding.
I know. I am a reluctant hylomorphist. Not happy about it. And I'm not entirely committed to it either. It's very loose for me. I could easily be swayed back to property dualism of some kind.
Substance dualism, because property dualism would say that your mind just arises from the brain.
I'm sorry. Did I say So substance dualism. I could easily be swayed back. I don't know. I could probably be swayed back to. I don't have strong views. It's just on most given days, depending on the side of the bed I wake up on, I come out thinking that we just are soulish flesh. That there isn't. That I'm not a ghost in a machine. that there is almost this one in the many and our own properties where we are at the same time entirely our bodies, at the same time entirely our soul, and those are somewhat indistinguishable. So I'm not going to defend it because I'm really not happy. You ever have a view that you're just not happy that it's your view, but you can't get away from it? I have that about my view of the kind of makeup of our ontology. So
yeah, I recently got kind of in a way persuaded to idealism, and I'm not necessarily happy about it. But I still use the term dualism because what was the kind of the consensus between me and Mike Jones is, but you still have to make distinctions in kinds of information. So like the kind of information that makes up this table is different than the information that is my mind. So I still call myself a dualist in that sense.
Yeah, and hylomorphists are typically, we're fine with that usually, saying, well, my mind doesn't have the same property as my finger, but neither does my ear. So, yeah.
But so here's a question. I'm assuming he's assuming that you know who this Clark character is. What is your perspective on Clark's argument against the problem of evil? Do you think it's merely just a warped version of the free will defense?
I don't know if I know Clark's. I might know the argument, but I don't know it if I know it, I don't know it as Clark's argument.
Okay. Fair enough. Well, this has been, I think, by far one of the richest conversations I've had on this program, and I can't thank you enough, Tyler, for coming on and doing this. Definitely have to do some more in the future, maybe even get you on with some guy like Tim Stratton or Braxton Hunter or somebody if you'd be up for it. But no, thank you. Let me get it here. The YouTube channel, the Freed Thinker podcast, or no, just the Freed Thinker, but the Freed Thinker podcast and the blog is down in the description. So you guys can go down there, see that, go visit there, subscribe to his YouTube channel. And is there any other place where people should look for you?
No, just the blog mostly is where you're going to find whatever I post, whether it's on the podcast or a blog article or a YouTube video, that's kind of the dumping ground for it all. So if you want the main hub, the blog is actually the main hub. But if you subscribe to the channel, the YouTube channel, you get those when I get some videos up. If you subscribe to the podcast, wherever great podcasts are found, then you'll get those when that content uploads as well.
Awesome. And also go subscribe to JMD Apologetic 101's channel, and his merch shop. This episode brought to you by the CTTA mug. I love this mug. Lots of coffee in it.
Whatever, John.
And if you guys would like to support this ministry, subscribestar.com/TUA. You get access to early access to interviews and access to all kinds of bonus content not found on YouTube. And until next time, Tyler Vela, thank you so much for being here, brother, and we'll do it again soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having a senior citizen like me on.
And also, Epstein didn't kill himself.
Over the hill. What?
I said Epstein did not kill himself. Just throwing that out there.
Oh, well, thanks for that one. All right, everybody. Demonetized.